Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. The cabin loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the storm-ravaged sky. Lightning briefly illuminated its weathered boards and shattered windows before plunging it back into shadow. Standing there, rain stinging my face, I wondered if coming here had been a terrible decision. Yet, with the wind howling and my clothes soaked through, I realized I had no choice. Taking a deep breath, I stepped toward the door. I hadn't intended to hike alone, but my friend canceled at the last minute. It'll be fine, I reassured myself that morning under an overcast yet calm sky. I should have known better. The weather in these mountains was famously unpredictable, and I was caught off guard when the storm suddenly hit. Now, as I pushed open the creaking door of the abandoned cabin, I silently cursed my own stubbornness. The hinges groaned, and I winced at the sound, irrationally fearing I might disturb something lurking in the darkness beyond. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely carrying over the howling wind. Silence. Fumbling for my flashlight, I clicked it on and swept the beam across the room. Dust motes swirled in the light, stirred by my entrance. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A rickety table, a couple of chairs, and what seemed to be an old stove in the corner. Cobwebs draped every surface, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath my feet. Despite the cabin's dilapidated state, it was a welcome refuge from the raging storm. I shrugged off my backpack and set it on the table, wincing as my soaked clothes clung to my skin. I needed to get dry and warm. Grateful that the waterproof cover on my pack had kept most of my belongings dry, I quickly changed into fresh clothes, draping the wet ones over a chair. But even as I worked, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to spot someone or something lurking in the shadows. "Get a grip," I muttered, trying to calm myself. "It's just an empty cabin." But was it? As the adrenaline of finding shelter faded, unsettling details began to stand out. A half-empty glass of water on the table, condensation still clinging to its surface, a warm patch near the stove, as if a fire had recently been burning. Most disturbing of all was the faint, rhythmic creaking sound coming from somewhere above me. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Hello?" I called, louder this time. "Is someone up there?" The creaking stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding rain. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, unmistakably, I heard footsteps overhead. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't alone. I pointed my flashlight at the ceiling. "I'm sorry to intrude," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I got caught in the storm and needed shelter. I don't mean to disturb anyone." No response. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel something, an unseen presence, as though someone was listening. "I'll leave as soon as the storm passes," I continued. "I promise I won't touch anything. I just need to wait it out." Still no answer. I lowered my flashlight, uncertain what to do. A part of me wanted to grab my things and run back into the storm. At least out there, I knew what I was dealing with. But logic told me that would be foolish. I was safe from the elements here, and whoever was upstairs hadn't made any aggressive moves yet. I decided to make the best of the situation. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor as far from the stairs as possible. and settled in to wait out the storm, I kept my flashlight close along with my pocket knife. A meager defense, but it made me feel a little better as the hours ticked by. I drifted in and out of a fitful sleep each time I woke. I listened intently for any sound from above. Sometimes I heard nothing, other times I caught faint noises, a creak of floorboards, a rustle of movement. Once, I could have sworn I heard breathing right at the top of the stairs. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe myself until the sound retreated. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I awoke to a new sound. The rain had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. I sat up, rubbing my eyes and fumbling for my flashlight. As I clicked it on a floorboard creak behind me, I whirled around, my heart pounding. There at the foot of the stairs stood a figure. I couldn't make out any details in the darkness, just a vague human shape. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and unnaturally still. "Hello," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching me. I scrambled to my feet, putting the table between us. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What do you want?" Slowly, so slowly, I wasn't sure if I was imagining it at first. The figure raised an arm, it pointed at me, then at the door. "You want me to leave?" I asked. A nod, just a slight movement, but unmistakable. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my backpack, not bothering to pack up my sleeping bag or change out of my sleep clothes. As I edged towards the door, giving the figure a wide berth, I kept my flashlight trained on it. It remained motionless, that long arm still pointing at the exit. Just as I reached for the doorknob, a floorboard creaked upstairs. My blood ran cold as I realized the figure in front of me wasn't the source of the noises I'd heard all night. There was someone else in the cabin. I yanked the door open and bolted outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean in the pre-dawn light. I could see the trail I'd come up on. I ran as if my life depended on it, not daring to look back until I'd put a good distance between myself and the cabin. When I finally paused to catch my breath, I turned and looked up the trail. The cabin was just visible through the trees, and there in the doorway, I could see not one, but two figures watching me. Even from this distance, I could tell they were inhumanly tall, their proportions all wrong. I didn't stick around to see what they would do next. I ran all the way back to my car, my mind reeling. What had I seen? Who or what were those figures? And what would have happened if I'd stayed? As I drove home, the rising sun slowly chasing away the shadows, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But I knew deep down that it had been real, all too real. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I also never went hiking alone again. And to this day, when I see an abandoned building, I keep walking, because now I know just because a place looks empty doesn't mean you're alone. As the years passed, I tried to put that night behind me. I convinced myself that stress and exhaustion had played tricks on my mind. The creaking noises, just an old cabin settling, the figure at the stairs, a shadow, nothing more. But deep down I knew I was lying to myself. It wasn't until 5 years later that the truth came crashing back. I was flipping through a local newspaper when a small article caught my eye. A group of hikers had gone missing in the mountains, last seen near an old cabin, the same cabin. My hand shook as I read the details. The hikers' belongings had been found inside, but there was no trace of the people themselves. The police were baffled. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. As I stared at the grainy photo accompanying the article, a chill ran down my spine. There in the doorway of the cabin, I could just make out a tall, shadowy figure, and behind it, barely visible, another. I dropped the newspaper, my mind reeling. All these years, I'd told myself I was safe, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But now I knew the truth. Whatever was in that cabin, it was still there, still waiting, and I was one of the lucky ones. who got away. The key card slid into the slot with a soft click, yo. But the lock didn't budge. I frowned, trying again, still nothing. I glanced at the room number 314. This was definitely the right door, so why wasn't it opening? I hadn't wanted to stay at this hotel. The neon sign flickered ominously as I pulled into the parking lot, and the paint was peeling off the walls. But it was late, I was exhausted, and the next town was miles away. I just needed a place to crash for the night. Now, standing in the dimly lit hallway, my suitcase at my feet, I was starting to regret my decision. I tried the key card one more time before giving up and heading back to the front desk. The lobby was deserted save for the night clerk, a young man with dark circles under his eyes and a slightly too wide smile. Excuse me, I said, approaching the desk. I'm having trouble with my key card, room 34. The clerk's smile faltered for a moment. He tapped at his computer, brow furrowing. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm not showing anyone checked into room 314. I blinked, confused. That can't be right. I just checked in an hour ago. You gave me the key yourself. He shook his head slowly. I'm affid. That's not possible. I've been here all night, and I haven't checked anyone. And a chill ran down my spine. I fumbled in my purse for the paper slip that held mine key card. A look, I said, pushing it across the desk. Room 34. You wrote it right here. The clerk examined the slip, his frown deepening. Ma'am, I don't recognize this handwriting, and we don't even use this type of key card anymore. He held it up, and I saw that it did look different from the sleek modern cards I'd seen him handling earlier. My head was spinning. I don't understand. I was just in that room. My things are there. Let's go take a look, he said, his tone plating. I followed him up to the third floor, a sense of unease growing with each step. When we reached room 314, the clerk used his master key to open the door. I rushed inside, expecting to see my suitcase on the bed, my jacket draped over the chair, but the room was empty, perfectly made up, as if no one had been there at all. This is impossible, I whispered, my voice shaking. My things were here. I unpacked. I took a shower. The clerk was looking at me with a mixture of concern and suspicion. Ma'am, are you feeling all right? Maybe you're confused about which hotel you're staying at. I shook my head vehemently. No, I'm not confused. I know I checked in here. I spoke to you. But even as I said it, doubt began to creep in. The clerk's face showed no recognition, no hint that he remembered our earlier interaction. Was it possible I had imagined the whole thing? I think perhaps you should sit down, the clerk said gently. Would you like me to call someone for you? I sank onto the bed, my mind reeling. No, I just need a minute to think. The clerk nodded and retreated, leaving me alone in the room that should have been mine, but clearly wasn't. I tried to retrace my steps to make sense of what was happening. I remembered driving up to the hotel, checking, and coming to this very room. I could picture myself unpacking, taking a quick shower, lying down on the bed for just a moment, and then what my memories became hazy after that. Had I fallen asleep, sleepwalked somehow? But that didn't explain why my belongings were missing, or why the clerk had no record of me. I pulled out my phone, thinking I could check my bank statement for the hotel charge, but my screen remained stubbornly black. Dead battery, of course. With shaking hands, I opened the nightstand drawer, looking for the usual hotel directory. Instead, I found a small notebook. Curious, I opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten notes. The ink faded, and the paper yellowed with age. I squinted, trying to make out the words in them. Dim light, day 47. Another guest vanished last night. That makes 3 this month. The others don't seem to notice, or maybe they do, and they're just too afraid to say anything. I don't know how much longer I can keep working here, but I'm afraid of what might happen if I try to leave. My blood ran cold. I flipped through more pages, each entry more disturbing than the last stories of guests checking in and never checking out of room numbers changing overnight, of staff members disappearing without a trace. The final entry caught my eye. If you're reading this, you're in danger. Get out now. Don't trust anyone. They won't let you leave. If they know you figured it out. I slammed the notebook shut. My heart pounding. This had to be some kind of joke, right? A prank to scare guests. But the tremor in my hands and the knot in my stomach told me this was all too real. I needed to get out of here now. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against it. The hallway beyond was silent. Slowly, carefully, I turned the handle and peeked out. Empty. I slipped into the corridor, my bare feet silent on the worn carpet. I had no idea where my shoes were, but I wasn't about to go looking for them now. As I crept toward the stairs, a door opened behind me. I froze, not daring to look back. Can I help you, ma'am? It was the clerk's voice. But something about it had changed. It was colder, harder. I ran. I hit the stairwell at full speed, taking the steps two at a time. I could hear footsteps behind me, faster than they should be inhuman. I burst into the lobby, gasping for breath. It looked different somehow. The furniture older, the wallpaper faded and peeling. And it was empty. No late night guests, no staff, just me. And the sound of those relentless footsteps getting closer. I sprinted for the front door, my lungs burning. Almost there. I reached for the handle, yanked. It didn't budge. No, 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 I moaned, pulling harder. The door remained stubbornly shut, as if it had been painted closed. I spun around, looking for another exit, and froze. The clerk stood there. But he wasn't the young man I'd seen earlier. His skin was gray and sagging, his eyes sunken and lifeless. When he smiled, his teeth were sharp and yellow. Leaving so soon? He asked, his voice a raspy whisper. But you've only just checked. And I backed away, my shoulders hitting the immovable door. What do you want from me? He tilted his head, regarding me with those dead eyes. What? Oh my dear, we don't want anything from you. We just want you to stay forever. As he spoke, more figures emerged from the shadows. Staff members, guests, all with that same gray skin, those same lifeless eyes. They moved towards me slowly, inexorably, like a tide of death. I screamed, pounding on the door behind me. Help, somebody help me. But there was no one to hear, no one to help. I was alone in a hotel that didn't exist, surrounded by people who weren't people at all. The clerk reached for me, his cold fingers brushing my arm. I recoiled, squeezing my eyes shut, bracing for the worst. And then I woke up. I bolted upright, gasping for breath. I was in a bed, my bed, in my apartment. Sunlight streamed through the window, and I could hear the familiar sounds of traffic outside. It had all been a dream, a horrifyingly vivid nightmare, but a dream nonetheless. I laughed shakily, running a hand through my sweat-soaked hair. Of course, it wasn't real. Vanishing hotel rooms, undead staff. It was absurd. Still, as I got up to start my day, I couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. The dream had felt so real, every detail sharp and clear in my mind. It wasn't until I was getting dressed that I noticed something odd. There on my nightstand was a small faded notebook. My blood ran cold as I picked it up with trembling hands and opened it to the first page. Day 1. I finally escaped. But I don't think I'm really free. They'll find me eventually. They always do. You're reading this, be careful, don't check in, because once they have you, they'll never let you leave. I dropped the notebook, my mind reeling. It wasn't possible, it couldn't be real. But as I looked around my familiar room, I noticed other small details that weren't quite right. The wallpaper pattern that didn't quite match my memories. The view outside my window that was just slightly off. And there on my dresser, a key card for room 314. I sank to the floor, the terrible truth washing over me. I hadn't escaped at all. The hotel had simply changed its appearance, trying to lull me into a false sense of security. But now I knew the truth. I was still checked in, and I would be forever the first. Raindrop hit the tent with a soft patter, barely audible over the crackling of our dying campfire. I glanced at Jenny, her face illuminated by the flickering flames, and saw my own unease reflected in her eyes. we'd been hearing strange noises all evening, but had chalked it up to the usual sounds of the forest now, as darkness fell, and the rain began in earnest. Those noises took on a more sinister tone. We hadn't planned on camping so deep in the woods. Our original spot, a popular campground near the lake, had been overrun with rowdy teenagers. When we arrived seeking peace and quiet, we'd ventured further into the forest, finally settling on a small clearing that seemed perfect in hindsight. I should have known better. In horror movies, it's always the couple that strays from the group that ends up in trouble. But this wasn't a horror movie, this was real life, and as I zipped up our tent against the intensifying rain, I told myself there was nothing to worry about. We were experienced campers, we had supplies, a map, and a vague idea of where the nearest ranger station was. We were fine. The rain picked up, drumming steadily against the tent's fabric. Jenny and I huddled in our sleeping bags, talking in low voices about our plans for the next day's hike. But as the night wore on, our conversation dwindled, replaced by an uneasy silence broken only by the sound of rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. It was nearing midnight when we heard it, a voice, low and indistinct, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond our tent. "Did you hear that?" Jenny whispered, her hand gripping my arm. I nodded, straining my ears for a moment. There was nothing but the rain. Then it came again, another voice different from the first, responding to something we couldn't make out. "Probably just other campers," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. We hadn't seen any signs of other people all day, and these voices didn't sound like casual campers. There was an urgency to them, a tension that set my nerves on edge. Jenny sat up, pressing her ear against the tent wall. "They're getting closer," she breathed. She was right. The voices were clearer now, though still too muffled by the rain to make out words. But it wasn't just voices anymore. There were footsteps, too, moving through the underbrush with purpose. "We should see who it is," I said, reaching for the tent zipper. "Maybe someone's lost and needs help." Jenny caught my hand. "Are you crazy? We don't know who's out there." Before I could respond, a beam of light swept across our tent, illuminating our huddled shapes through the thin fabric. Jenny stifled a gasp, and we both froze, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps circled our tent slowly, deliberately. I could see shadows moving here, low murmurs just on the other side of the nylon wall. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they must be able to hear it. "We know you're in there," a gruff voice called out, suddenly startlingly close. "Come on out. We just want to talk." Jenny and I exchanged terrified glances. The tone of the voice made it clear that talking was the last thing on their minds. "What do we do?" Jenny mouthed silently. I shook my head, at a loss. We were trapped. If we stayed in the tent, they could just rip it open. If we ran, we'd be at a disadvantage in the dark, rainy woods. Another voice joined the first. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Come out now, and nobody gets hurt." The lie was so blatant, it almost made me laugh instead. I leaned close to Jenny's ear and whispered, "When I say go, run for the trees. Don't look back, don't stop, just run." She nodded, her face pale but determined. I took a deep breath, steeling myself in one swift motion. I unzipped the tent and yelled, "Go!" We burst out of the tent like startled rabbits. I caught a glimpse of surprised faces, flashlight beams swinging wildly before I plunged into the darkness of the forest. I could hear Jenny crashing through the underbrush beside me, and behind us shouts of anger and pounding footsteps. The rain lashed at my face as I ran, branches whipping past, unseen roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea where we were going. All I knew was that we had to get away, had to lose our pursuers in the tangle of the forest. A gunshot cracked through the air, shockingly loud. Jenny screamed, and I reached out, blindly grabbing her hand and pulling her along. "Keep going," I gasped. We ran until my lungs were burning, until each breath felt like fire in my chest. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but I didn't dare stop, not yet. Finally, when I felt like I couldn't take another step, I spotted a large fallen tree, its uprooted base creating a small sheltered space. I tugged Ginny towards it, and we crawled into the muddy hollow, trying to quiet our ragged breathing. For a long time, we just sat there huddled together, listening. The rain continued to fall, but beyond that the forest was quiet. No voices, no footsteps, just the steady drip of water from leaves and the occasional far-off rumble of thunder. Do you think we lost them? Ginny whispered eventually. I don't know, I admitted, but we can't stay here. We need to find help. As the adrenaline wore off, I became acutely aware of our situation. We were lost in the woods, in the middle of the night, in a rainstorm. We had no supplies, no phones, not even shoes. We'd fled the tent in our socks, which were now soaked through and muddy. And somewhere out there, unknown men with guns were looking for us. We need to move, I said, peering out from our hiding spot. Can you walk? Ginny nodded, though I could see she was shivering. I wasn't much better off. We were both soaked to the skin, cold and terrified, but we couldn't stay here. We crawled out from under the fallen tree and stood trying to get our bearings. The rain had let up a bit, but the clouds obscured any stars that might have helped us navigate. I tried to remember the direction we'd run from our campsite, thinking we should head the opposite way. This way, I said, pointing. I think there's a road a few miles in that direction. If we can reach it, we might be able to flag down a car. We set off, moving as quietly as we could through the wet undergrowth. Every snapping twig made us flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. More than once we froze at the sound of movement nearby, only to realize it was just an animal or the wind in the trees. As we walked, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Who were those men? What did they want? The campsite had clearly been a trap, but for who specifically? Or just any unlucky campers who happened to stumble upon it? The questions whirled in my head, unanswerable and terrifying. All I knew was that we had to keep moving, had to find help before those men found us. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the sky when we finally heard the distant hum of traffic. The sound gave us renewed energy, and we pushed forward, ignoring our aching feet and exhausted bodies. We broke through the tree line onto the shoulder of a highway just as the sun was rising. The sight of a passing car, the first sign of normal civilized life we'd seen in what felt like years, nearly made me cry with relief. We flagged down the first vehicle. We saw a middle-aged couple in an RV who looked alarmed at our bedraggled appearance. They called the police for us and gave us blankets and hot coffee while we waited. When the police arrived we told them everything. They looked skeptical at first, but a search of the area where we camped turned up evidence that corroborated our story: empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and most damning of all, shell casing from a gun. The officers told us we were lucky. There had been reports of a group targeting isolated campers in the area, robbing them, sometimes worse. By running, we'd likely saved our lives. In the days that followed, as we gave statements and tried to piece our lives back together, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close we'd come to becoming just another statistic, another mysterious disappearance in the vast wilderness. We never went camping again after that night. The forest, once a place of peace and adventure, now held only terror and bad memories. But sometimes on rainy nights, when the wind whistles around the corners of our house, I find myself straining to listen, and in the gaps between the raindrops, I could swear I hear footsteps circling, always circling in the darkness. Just beyond the light, the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the torrent of rain. As I squinted through the glass, searching for any sign of the road I'd been driving for hours, trying to outrun the storm, but it seemed determined to follow me. As another flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, I caught a glimpse of a faded wooden sign, Millbrook 5 miles. I breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe I could find a motel there and wait out this deluge. But as the miles ticked by, the storm only intensified. The rain was coming down so hard now that I could barely see a few feet in front of my car. I slowed to a crawl, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. That's when I saw it, a dirt road branching off to the right with another sign that read shortcut to Millbrook. I hesitated for a moment. I'd heard plenty of stories about shortcuts and that led nowhere good, but the prospect of getting off this treacherous main road and reaching town sooner was too tempting to pass up. I turned onto the dirt road, feeling the car lurch as it hit the uneven surface. For a while things seemed okay. The road wound through dense forest, the trees offering some shelter from the worst of the rain. But as I drove deeper into the woods, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. The road was getting narrower, muddier. I hadn't seen another vehicle or any signs of civilization from miles. Just as I was beginning to think I'd made a terrible mistake, my headlights illuminated a structure ahead. A farmhouse, old but well-maintained, stood in a clearing. Warm light spilled from the windows, and I could see a barn and a couple of outbuildings nearby. My relief was palpable. Even if this wasn't Millbrook, surely the residents could point me in the right direction. I pulled up to the house and killed the engine, taking a deep breath before making a dash through the rain to the porch. As I raised my hand to knock, the door swung open. A man stood there, tall and lean, with weathered features that spoke of a life spent outdoors. He looked at me with a mixture of surprise and something else I couldn't quite place. Suspicion. "Maybe can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff. "I'm so sorry to bother you," I said, trying to keep my teeth from chattering as the cold rain seeped through my clothes. "I was trying to get to Millbrook, but I think I took a wrong turn. Could you point me in the right direction?" The man's expression softened slightly. "Millbrook? You're a long way off, miss. That road doesn't go through anymore. Washed out in the floods last spring." My heart sank. "Oh no, I don't suppose there's another way around." He shook his head. "Not in this weather. These back roads turn into rivers when it rains like this. You'd best come inside and wait it out." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to politely decline and try to find my way back to the main road, but a particularly loud crack of thunder made me jump, and I realized I didn't have much choice. "Thank you," I said, following him into the house. The interior was cozy, if a bit cluttered. Mismatched furniture filled the living room, and the walls were covered with old photographs and bits of farming equipment that seemed more decorative than functional. A fire crackled in the hearth, and I gravitated towards it, grateful for the warmth. "I'm John," the man said, closing the door behind us. "My wife Martha is in the kitchen. Make yourself comfortable. I'll let her know we have a guest." As John disappeared down a hallway, I took the opportunity to look around more closely. The photos on the wall showed a family: John, a woman I assumed was Martha, and two children at various ages. But there was something off about them. The clothes and hairstyles looked outdated, like they were from decades ago. I was squinting at one particularly faded photo when a voice behind me made me jump. "Supper's almost ready. If you'd like to join us." I turned to see a woman standing in the doorway to what I assumed was the kitchen. Like John, she had a weathered look about her, but her smile was kind. "Oh, I couldn't impose," I started to say, but Martha waved away my protest. "Nonsense. We don't get many visitors out here. It'll be nice to have someone new at the table." I followed her into the kitchen, where the smell of something savory made my stomach growl. I hadn't realized how hungry I was. John was already seated at the table, and Martha gestured for me to take a seat across from him. As we ate, I tried to make conversation, but found my hosts oddly reticent. They answered my questions politely enough, but offered little information of their own. When I asked about the town or their neighbors, they exchanged a glance I couldn't interpret. "Not much to tell," John said finally. "We keep to ourselves mostly after dinner." I offered to help with the dishes, but Martha shed me away. "You're our guest. John will show you to the spare room. You can head out in the morning when the storm's past." I followed John upstairs, my unease growing with each step. The second floor was dark, lit only by the flashlight John carried. He showed me to a small room at the end of the hall, bathrooms across the way. He said, "If you need anything, just holler." As he turned to leave, I blurted out, "Where are your children?" John froze his hand on the doorknob. "What children?" "In the photos downstairs." I said. I saw pictures of 2 kids. For a long moment John didn't move. When he finally turned to face me, his expression was unreadable in the dim light. "Those pictures are very old," he said softly. "Good night." He closed the door, leaving me alone in the darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. When I flipped it, power must be out, I thought, trying to calm my racing heart. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind whirling. Something was very wrong here, but I couldn't put my finger on what. The storm continued to rage outside, rain lashing against the windows. I knew I wouldn't be able to leave until morning, but the thought of spending the night in this strange house filled me with dread. Unable to sleep, I decided to explore a bit. I crept out of the room and down the hall, using my phone's flashlight to guide me. The house was silent, except for the sound of the rain and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I made my way back downstairs, drawn to those old photographs in the harsh light of my phone. They looked even stranger than before. The faces were blurred, as if they'd been deliberately smudged. And in every photo, no matter what the setting, the same shadowy figure lurked in the background. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I spun around, my heart in my throat. Martha stood there, her face half in shadow. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice oddly flat. "I'm sorry," I stammered. I was curious about the photos." Martha moved closer, her eyes never leaving my face. "You shouldn't be down here," she said. "It's not safe." "What do you mean?" I asked, backing away slowly. "What's not safe?" But Martha didn't answer. She just kept advancing, her expression unchanging. I bumped into something solid and turned to find John blocking my path to the stairs. "I'm sorry," he said, and he genuinely sounded it, "but you've seen too much. We can't let you leave now." Panic surged through me. I ducked under John's arm and ran for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear John and Martha behind me, their footsteps slow and deliberate. "You don't understand," Martha was saying. "We're trying to protect you. The storm, it's not natural. Nothing here." As I ran from room to room looking for a way out, but every door and window was locked tight. John and Martha followed, never rushing, always just a few steps behind. "What do you want from me?" I cried, cornered in the kitchen. John sighed heavily. "We don't want anything from you. We're trapped here just like you are now. The storm never ends. The night never passes. We're caught in a loop, reliving the same night over and over." "That's impossible," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. I had felt it from the moment I entered this house, the sense of time being wrong, of reality being slightly as so. "We thought we could save you," Martha said. "If we kept you here, maybe you'd be spared what's out there. But it doesn't work that way. It never does." As if on cue, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the kitchen. In that brief moment, I saw Jan and Martha for what they truly were: not living people, but shadows. Empty outlines where people should be. When my vision cleared, they were gone. The house around me seemed to shimmer and fade like a mirage in the desert. I blinked, and suddenly I was back in my car, still parked on that dirt road where I had first seen the farmhouse. The rain had stopped. Dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight peeking through the trees. My hand shook as I started the engine and carefully backed up, returning to the main road. As I drove towards Millbrook, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. But what exactly had happened in that house? Was it all a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion in the storm? I'll never know for sure, but sometimes on rainy nights when I'm driving alone, I catch glimpses of a farmhouse in my rearview mirror, warm light spilling from its windows, and I drive a little faster, never looking back, always moving forward, because I know now that some shortcuts are better left untaken. and some storms are best weathered alone. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence. The usual chorus of bird song that had accompanied my mornings in the wilderness was conspicuously absent as I unzipped my tent and peered out into the misty dawn. An unsettling feeling crept over me. Something was different, something was wrong. I had come to these woods to escape after months of grueling work and a messy breakup. I needed time alone to clear my head. The solitude of solo camping had seemed like the perfect solution. Now, on my third morning in the back country, I was beginning to question that decision. Crawling out of my tent, I stretched and surveyed my campsite. That's when I saw them, footprints in the soft earth around my tent. My breath caught in my throat. They weren't my boots, and they certainly weren't from any animal. I knew these were bare human footprints, and they circled my tent multiple times. My heart began to race as I followed the tracks with my eyes. They led to my backpack, which was sitting where I'd left it the night before, propped against a tree. But now it was unzipped, its contents slightly askew. I rushed over to it, my hand shaking as I rifled through my belongings. Nothing seemed to be missing, but everything had been touched, moved ever so slightly from its original position. I spun around, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, any hint of who might have invaded my camp during the night. But the forest was still, the mist clinging to the ground and muffling any sounds that might have given away an intruder's position. Trying to calm my racing thoughts, I took a deep breath and tried to think rationally. Maybe it was just another hiker who had stumbled upon my camp in the dark. Maybe they were lost and looking for supplies. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. No lost hiker would circle a tent multiple times or go through someone's belongings so methodically without waking them. I needed to get out of here. I started packing up my gear as quickly and quietly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There on the ground just inside my tent was a small, intricately carved wooden figure. I knew with absolute certainty that it hadn't been there when I went to sleep. With trembling fingers, I picked up the figure. It was rough, but clearly meant to depict a human form. Notches had been carved where the eyes should be, giving it an unsettling hollow gaze. As I turned it over in my hands, I felt something sticky. Looking closer, I realized with horror that the base of the figure was coated in a dark, cyan reddish-brown substance, blood. I dropped the figure as if it had burned me and scrambled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was no lost hiker. This was something much worse. Abandoning any pretense of stealth, I shoved the rest of my gear haphazard into my backpack. I needed to get back to civilization, back to safety. I slung the pack over my shoulders and set off at a brisk pace, trying to remember the route I had taken to get here. As I walked, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees, which had seemed welcoming and peaceful just days ago, now loomed menacingly. Every shadow held a potential threat, every sound a possible pursuer. I found myself constantly looking back over my shoulder, sure that at any moment I would see someone or something following me. After what felt like hours of walking, I realized with growing panic that nothing looked familiar. The landmarks I had carefully noted on my way and were nowhere to be seen. Had I taken a wrong turn, or had the forest itself somehow changed, rearranging itself to confuse and trap me? I stopped to check my map and compass, hoping to reorient myself, but as I pulled them out of my pack, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. The map had been altered. Crude drawings had been added in what looked like charcoal, stick figures scattered across the paper, all with the same hollow eyes as the wooden figure from my tent. And there, right where I estimated my current position to be, was a larger figure waiting. I dropped the map, my hand shaking uncontrollably. Now this couldn't be happening. It had to be some sort of sick joke. or a stress-induced hallucination, but the footprint prints, the wooden figure, the altered map, it was all too real, too tangible to be a figment of my imagination. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, and I whirled around, my heart in my throat. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape, just for a second before it disappeared behind a large oak. Without thinking, I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and whatever was back there as possible. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but terror drove me onward. As I ran, I became aware of sounds behind me, footsteps keeping pace, but never quite catching up. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from my left, sometimes my right. Occasionally, I could have sworn they were right beside me, though I saw nothing when I dared to glance to the side, just when I thought I couldn't run any further. I burst out of the tree line. Into a small clearing in the center stood an old dilapidated cabin. Its windows were dark, the door hanging crookedly on rusty hinges. Every instinct told me to keep running, to not trust this sudden appearance of shelter. But I was exhausted, and the footsteps behind me were getting closer. I made a split-second decision and sprinted for the cabin. I hit the door with my shoulder, wincing at the pain, but grateful when it swung open. I slammed it shut behind me and frantically looked around for something to barricade it with. An old heavy table stood against one wall. With strength born of desperation, I dragged it in front of the door. Only then did I allow myself to stop and catch my breath. The cabin was dark, dust motes dancing in the few beams of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. It smelled of mold and decay, and as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw that the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, scraps of paper, and more of those unsettling wooden figures. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room, looking for another way out. There had to be a back door or a window I could climb through if I needed to, but as I turned to explore further, my foot caught on something, and I stumbled. Looking down, I saw a trapo in the floor, half hidden under a ratty old rug. My curiosity wed with my fear. What was down there? A cellar where I could hide, or something worse? Before I could decide whether or not to open it, I heard its footsteps on the porch outside, slow, deliberate, coming closer with each passing second. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall, praying that the barricade would hold. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For a long moment there was silence, then a sound that made my blood run cold. Soft laughter, followed by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I've been waiting for you," it said, the words slithering through the cracks in the walls. "We have so much to talk about." The door began to shake, the table scraping against the floor as something pushed against it from the outside. I looked frantically around the room, searching for a weapon, an escape route, anything. My eyes fell on the trapo. With no other choice, I ran to it and yanked it open. A dark hole yawned beneath me, the bottom lost in shadows. The pushing at the door was getting stronger, the wood beginning to splinter. I took a deep breath, sent up a silent prayer, and jumped into the darkness. I fell for what felt like an eternity, the air rushing past me, my stomach lurching, then suddenly impact, but not the hard ground I was expecting. Instead, I landed on something soft, giving. I opened my eyes, disoriented. I was in my tent. Sunlight was streaming through the fabric. Birds were singing outside. I sat up, my heart pounding, looking wildly around. Everything was as I had left it the night before. No footprints, no wooden figures, no altered map. Had it all been a dream, a vivid nightmare brought on by stress and isolation? I wanted to believe that, but as I moved to unzip the tent, my hand brushed against something small and hard there, half buried. In my sleeping bag was a tiny wooden figure. Its hollow eyes stared up at me, and I could have sworn I heard distant laughter on the breeze that rustled through the trees. I was packed in on the trail within minutes, heading back to civilization as fast as my legs would carry me. I didn't know what had happened, what was real, and what wasn't, but I knew. One thing for certain, I was never going camping alone again. The neon sign flickered ominously as we pulled into the diner's parking lot, casting an eerie red glow across the rain-slicked asphalt. L's pit stop at red, though the CON stop had long since burned out. I glanced at my best friend Sarah and saw my own unease reflected in her eyes. We hadn't planned on stopping here, but after hours of driving through the night, we were both exhausted and in desperate need of coffee. It's just a quick stop, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We'll be back on the road before you know it. Sarah nodded, but I could tell she was just as apprehensive as I was. There was something off about this place, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but it was the only sign of civilization we'd seen for miles, and with our gas tank hovering dangerously close to empty, we didn't have much choice. The bell above the door jingled as we entered, drawing the attention of the few patrons scattered throughout the dimly lit diner. An older man at the counter turned to look at us, his eyes narrowing suspiciously before he returned to his coffee. A group of men in the corner booth fell silent, their conversation dying abruptly as they took in our appearance. I suddenly felt very aware of how out of place we must look. Two young women, clearly not from around here, our clothes rumpled from the long drive. I tugged self-consciously at the hem of my shirt as we made our way to an empty booth near the back. The vinyl seats were cracked and worn, and the table was sticky with what I hoped was just spilled syrup. A tired-looking waitress appeared almost immediately, her pen poised over a worn notepad. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice grabbed from years of cigarettes. "Just coffee, please," I said. "For both of us." She nodded and shuffled away, leaving Sarah and me to take in our surroundings. The diner looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, with faded photographs lining the walls and an ancient jukebox in the corner that had probably been silent for years. "I don't like this place," Sarah whispered, leaning across the table. "Something feels wrong." I was about to agree when the waitress returned with our coffee. As she set the mugs down, I caught a glimpse of a dark bruise on her wrist, partially hidden by her sleeve. She saw me looking and quickly pulled her arm back, avoiding eye contact. "You girls just passing through?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes darting nervously to the group in the corner. "Yeah, we're on our way to," I started to say, but Sarah kicked me under the table. I realized my mistake too late. It probably wasn't wise to tell strangers our destination. "We're just taking a road trip," Sarah finished smoothly, "and no real destination in mind." The waitress nodded, a flicker of something relief, concern passing across her face. "Well, you be careful out there. These roads can be dangerous at night." As she walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that her words held more meaning than a simple warning about driving conditions. We sipped our coffee in silence, both of us on edge. That's when I started to notice the conversations around us. At first, it was just snippets, words that didn't quite make sense out of context, but as I listened more closely, a chill ran down my spine. The men in the corner were talking in low, urgent tones. I caught phrases like "shipment coming in" and "need to move it fast." One of them mentioned a new girl, and they all laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. I looked at Sarah, and I could tell from her expression that she'd heard it too. We needed to leave now, but as I reached for my wallet to pay for the coffee, I realized with a sinking feeling that I couldn't find my car keys. I distinctly remembered putting them in my pocket when we entered the diner, but now they were gone. "Sarah," I whispered, trying to keep the panic out of my voice, "I can't find my keys." Her eyes widened. "What, are you sure?" I nodded, my heart racing. "They must have fallen out somewhere. Help me look." We searched as discreetly as we could, checking under the table and in the cracks of the booth seats, but the keys were nowhere to be found. The bell above the door jingled again, and I looked up to see a police officer enter the diner. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. Surely he could help us, but then I saw the way the men in the corner greeted him, the familiar nods and smiles. My blood ran cold as I realized he was probably in on whatever was happening here. We need to get out of here, I whispered to Sarah. Now she nodded, her face pale. We stood up, trying to act casual as we made our way to the door. But before we could reach it, one of the men from the corner booth stepped into our path. Leaving so soon? He asked, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Why don't you stay a while? We don't get many visitors around here. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the diner on us. The waitress stood behind the counter, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. The police officer watched with detached interest, making no move to intervene. We really need to get going, Sarah said, her voice steadier than I expected. Thanks for the coffee. We tried to step around him, but he moved to block us. Again, now, he said, his tone turning menacing. That's not very friendly. We're just trying to be hospitable. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see another man from the group standing behind us. We were trapped in that moment. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the glint of metal as one of the men reached into his jacket. The waitress turned away, unable to watch. The police officer stood up, his hand moving to his holster. But then something unexpected happened. The older man from the counter, the one who had eyed us suspiciously when we first entered, suddenly spoke up. Let them go, Frank, he said, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the diner freeze. They're not worth it. Trouble. The man blocking our path. Frank hesitated, looking uncertainly between us and the older man. But Dad, he started to say. I said, let them go. The older man repeated, his tone brooking no argument. We've got bigger things to worry about tonight. For a tense moment, I thought Frank might argue, but then he stepped aside, his face a mask of barely contained anger. You heard him. He growled, get out, and don't even think about coming back this way. We didn't need to be told twice. Sarah and I bolted for the door, not stopping until we reached our car. By some miracle, the keys were sitting on the driver's seat, clearly visible through the window. Had they been there all along, or had someone planted them there while we were inside? I unlocked the car with shaking hands, and we jumped in. As I started the engine, I saw the group of men emerge from the diner watching us. The older man stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I threw the car into reverse and peeled out of the parking lot, my heart pounding in my ears. We drove in silence for several miles, both of us too shaken to speak. Finally, when the diner had long since disappeared in our rear view mirror, Sarah turned to me. What just happened back there? I shook my head, still trying to process it all. I don't know, but I think we just narrowly escaped something terrible. We drove through the night, not stopping again until we reached the next major town. As we checked into a motel, both of us too wired to sleep despite our exhaustion, I couldn't shake the memory of that diner, the suspicious glances, the overheard conversations, the fear in the waitress's eyes. I never reported what happened that night. Who would believe us? And what exactly would we report? But to this day, whenever I see a lonely diner on a dark stretch of road, I keep driving. Some stops I've learned are better left unmade. The first thing I noticed about Mill Haven was the silence. No birds chirping, no distant hum of traffic, not even the rustle of wind through leaves, just an eerie, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow every sound I'd stumbled upon. The town by accident, my GPS having failed miles back on a hike gone wrong. As I limped down the empty main street, my sprained ankle throbbing, I didn't shake the feeling that I'd walked into someplace I wasn't supposed to be. I'd set out that morning with high spirits, eager to tackle a new trail I'd read about online. The website had promised stunning views and a moderate difficulty level, perfect for a solo day hike. But 3 hours and I realized I grossly underestimated the terrain. The path grew increasingly treacherous and my water supply dwindled faster than I'd anticipated. Then came the fall, one misstep on a loose rock, and I found myself tumbling down a steep incline, my ankle twisting painfully beneath me. By the time I managed to stop my descent, I was disoriented in pain and completely lost. My phone showed no signal, and my GPS app refused to load. With the sun starting to dip towards the horizon, I knew I had to find help fast. That's when I saw the faint outline of rooftops in the distance. Hope surged through me as I hobbled towards what I prayed was civilization. But as I drew closer, that hope began to curdle into unease. Mill Haven looked like it had been frozen in time. The storefronts along Main Street could have been plucked straight out of the 1950s. Their paint faded, but still eerily pristine cars sat parked at odd angles, as if their drivers had simply vanished mid-journey. And everywhere, that unsettling silence. Hello, I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the still air. Is anyone here? I need help. No response. Not even an echo. It was as if the very air swallowed my words. I limped towards what looked like a diner, its neon open sign flickering weakly in the fading daylight. The bell above the door let out a muffled ding as I entered, and I found myself in a perfectly preserved slice of mid-century Americana. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and a jukebox stood side ENT in the corner, but there wasn't a soul inside. Hello, I tried again, softer this time, as if afraid to disturb the unnatural quiet. Please, I'm hurt. I need to call for help. As my eyes adjusted to the dim interior, I noticed something odd on one of the tables. A half-eaten meal sat congealing on a plate, the coffee in the mug beside it still steaming. It was as if the diner patrons had vanished mid-bite. A chill ran down my spine. Something was very, very wrong here. I backed out of the diner, my heart racing. The street looked different now, shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower. And then I saw a movement in one of the shop windows across the street, a face pale and gaunt peering out at me before quickly disappearing behind a curtain. Wait, I called out, stumbling towards the shop. Please, I need help. As I reached for the door handle, it swung open, and I found myself face to face with an elderly woman. Her eyes were sunken, her skin papery thin, but there was a sharpness to her gaze that made me take a step back. You shouldn't be here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not safe after dark. Before I could respond, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me inside, slamming the door behind us. The shop appeared to be some kind of general store, shelves stocked with dusty canned goods and outdated household items. What's going on? I asked, my voice shaking. Where is everyone? I just need to call for help. My ankle she is pressing a bony finger to her lips. They'll hear you, who? I whispered back, fear coiling in my gut. The old woman peered out the window, her eyes darting back and forth. The others, she said cryptically, the ones who took everyone else. We thought they were a blessing at first. You know, they came with promises of a better life, of immortality. And oh, how we believed them. I stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. I don't understand. What happened to this town? She turned back to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and fear. They came 5 years ago. Strangers offered you a miracle drug, said it would stop aging, cure all illnesses. And it worked for a while. But then her voice trailed off, and she shuddered. People started to change, not just stopping aging, but reverting, getting younger, too young, until they just disappeared. Babies one day, gone the next. And those of us who didn't take it well, we the only ones left, hiding, waiting. I felt dizzy, her words painting a picture too horrific to fully comprehend. But that's impossible. I stammered, things like that don't happen in real life. The old woman let out a bitter laugh. Oh my dear, you have no idea what's possible. But you need to leave now, before they find you. As if on cue, a low humming sound filled the air. The old woman's eyes widened in terror. They're coming, she whispered. You need to hide. She shoved me towards a back room, but I resisted. Wait, I can't just leave you here. Come with me. We can both escape. But she shook her head firmly. I'm too old too. Slow, I'll only slow you down. Go now. And whatever you do, don't let them catch you. Don't let them offer you anything. Just run. The humming grew louder, and I could see a strange pulsing light through the shop windows against my better judgment. I did, as the old woman said, limping as fast as I could towards the back of the store. I found a small storage room and squeezed inside, pulling the door shut behind me. Through a crack in the door, I watched as the shop filled with an otherworldly blue light. I could hear voices, but they didn't sound human, more like a chorus of whispers, all speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. I held my breath, pressing myself against the back wall of the storage room. The voices grew closer, and I saw shadows moving just outside my hiding place. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they must be able to hear it. Then suddenly silence, the light faded, and the humming stopped. I waited, barely daring to breathe, and for what felt like hours, finally, when I couldn't stand it any longer, I slowly opened the door and peered out. The shop was empty, no sign of the old woman or the strange being she had warned me about. I crept out, my ankle protesting with every step, and made my way back to the front of the store. Outside, Millhaven looked exactly as it had before, empty, silent, frozen in time. But now I knew the terrifying truth that lurked beneath its surface. I didn't wait around to see if the beings would return. Ignoring the pain in my ankle, I ran until the town was far behind me, until I found a road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver looked at me like I was crazy when I told him about Millhaven, but he was kind enough to give me a ride to the nearest hospital. I never reported what I saw in that town. Who would believe me? Sometimes I almost don't believe it myself, but on quiet nights when the world seems too still, I remember the old woman's warning, and I wonder about the people of Millhaven, about the terrible price they paid for the promise of eternal youth. And I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that there are some places in this world that are better left undiscovered, some communities that once you wander in you might never wander out of again. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the torrential downpour. As I squinted through the glass, desperately searching for any signs of life along the desolate highway I'd been driving for hours, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, cursing myself for taking this shortcut. The radio crackled to life, breaking the monotonous sound of rain pelting the car roof. I reached to turn it up, hoping for a weather report or any news that might lift my spirits. Instead, what I heard made my blood run cold. Repeat, be on the lookout for escaped convict Michael Reeves, last seen in the vicinity of County Road 17. Reeves is considered armed and extremely dangerous. Do not approach. I glanced at my GPS. County Road 17. The very road I was on. My heart raced as I peered into the darkness beyond my headlights. That's when I saw him, a figure on the side of the road, arm outstretched, thumb raised in the universal signal for a ride. As I drew closer, I could make out more details. A man soaked to the bone, his clothes hanging heavy on his thin frame. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but something made me slow down. Maybe it was the pang of empathy I felt, remembering times I'd been stranded myself, or maybe it was the nagging voice in my head reminding me that the news report could be about anyone. What were the odds it was this specific man? Whatever the reason, I found myself pulling over the car's tires, crunching on the gravel shoulder. The man jogged up to the passenger side, and I lowered the window. Just a crack. Thank you, he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. I've been out here for hours. My car broke down a few miles back. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door lock. Where are you headed? Next town over would be great, he replied, offering a grateful smile. I've got family there who can help me out against my better judgment. I unlocked the door hop, and I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. He slid into the passenger seat, bringing with him the smell of rain and something else, a faint metallic scent I couldn't quite place. As we pulled back onto the road, I snuck a glance at him. He was younger than I'd initially thought, probably in his early 30s. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and he had a few days' worth of stubble on his chin, but it was his eyes that caught my attention, dark and intense, darting around the car's interior, as if cataloging every detail. "I'm Jack," I said, breaking the awkward silence. "What's your name?" He hesitated for just a moment too long. "Mike," he finally answered. "Thanks again for stopping. Not many people would pick up a stranger in weather like this." I nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Well, I'd hoped someone would do the same for me. If I were in your shoes." We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the dull roar of rain on the roof. I could feel Mike's eyes on me, studying me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "So, Jack," he said, suddenly making me jump, "what brings you out to this lonely stretch of road on a night like this?" I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Just heading home from a business trip. Thought I'd take a shortcut, but I'm starting to regret that decision." Mike chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "Funny how shortcuts often end up taking us places we never intended to go, isn't it?" I nodded, unsure how to respond. The silence stretched between us again, heavy and oppressive. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my palms swaying despite the car's cool interior. "Mind if I turn on the radio?" Mike asked, his hand already reaching for the dial. "Sure," I said, grateful for any distraction. He fiddled with the tuner, static filling the car before a clear signal came through. It was the same news station I'd been listening to earlier. "Once again, police are urging citizens to be on high alert. Escaped convict Michael Reeves is still at large." Reeves was serving a life sentence for multiple homicides and is considered extremely dangerous. He was last seen wearing a dark jacket and jeans. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized the description matched my passenger exactly. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, meeting Mike's. No, Michael's gaze. In that moment, I knew he knew that I knew. The atmosphere in the car changed instantly. The tension, which had been simmering beneath the surface, now crackled like electricity. I could see Michael's hand moving slowly towards his jacket pocket. "Pull over," he said, his voice low and menacing. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. We were miles from anywhere, no other cars on the road. If I stopped now, I was as good as dead. I said, "Pull over." Michael growled, his hand now clearly gripping something in his pocket. Instead of slowing down, I did the only thing I could think of. I forded the car, lurched forward, tires fighting for grip on the rain-slicked road. Michael was thrown back in his seat, cursing loudly. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted, struggling to right himself. "Saving my life," I answered, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. What followed was a terrifying game of cat and mouse played out at 80 miles per hour on a winding, rain-soaked highway. Michael lunged for the wheel, trying to force us off the road. I fought back, swerving wildly, praying to whatever higher power might be listening that we wouldn't crash. In the chaos, Michael's hand slipped from his pocket, and I saw what he'd been reaching for: a wicked-looking night knife, its blade glinting in the dim light of the dashboard. My heart nearly stopped at the sight of it. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be, Jack," Michael said, his voice eerily calm as he brandished the knife. "Just pull over, and I promise I'll make it quick." "Not a chance," I spat back, my eyes darting between the road and the weapon. Suddenly, I saw something that made my heart leap. Headlights in the distance coming towards us. It was the first sign of another vehicle I'd seen in hours. If I could just hold out until we reached them. Michael saw them too, his face contorted with rage as he realized his window of opportunity was closing with a roar of frustration. He lunged at me, the knife slashing through the air. I jerked the wheel hard to the right, sending the car into a spin. The world outside became a blur of rain and darkness. As we whirled across the road, I heard Michael cry out, saw a flash of movement as he was thrown against the passenger door. Then, with a sickening crunch, we came to a stop. The airbag exploded in my face, dazing me momentarily. As I fought to clear my head, I became aware of two things: the approaching sound of sirens, and the fact that the passenger seat beside me was empty. I fumbled with my seat belt, every movement sending shock waves of pain through my battered body. Stumbling out of the wreckage, I saw a dark figure limping away into the woods that lined the highway. The sirens grew louder, and soon the night was awash in red and blue flashing lights. Police cars and an ambulance screeched to a halt around me. As paramedics rushed to check me over, I heard one of the officers speaking urgently into his radio: suspect spotted fleeing into the woods off County Road 17. All units converge on this location. He's on foot and possibly injured. As I was loaded into the ambulance, I caught snippets of conversation from the officers on the scene. They'd been tracking Michael for hours, always one step behind. If I hadn't picked him up, if I hadn't heard that radio broadcast, if I hadn't taken that ill-fated shortcut, the wall. It swirled in my mind as shock began to set in the days that followed. As I recovered in the hospital and gave countless statements to police, the full weight of what had happened began to sink, and I'd come face to face with a killer and lived to tell the tale. Michael Reeves was caught 2 days later, found hiding in an abandoned barn not far from where I'd crashed. They say he'd killed 3 people since his escape. I would have been number 4 now. Whenever I see a hitchhiker on the side of the road, I think back to that rainy night. Part of me wants to stop to help someone who might genuinely be in need, but a larger part, the part that remembers the glint of that knife and the cold look in Michael's eyes, keeps driving, because sometimes the most dangerous shortcuts are the ones we take with our trust. The first siren cut through the night like a knife, jolting me from a fitful sleep. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. The sound seemed unreal, out of place in the peaceful campground nestled at the foot of the old dam. But as the wail grew louder, joined by others in a cacophony of warning, the terrible truth dawned on me. This was no dream. This was a nightmare coming to life. I had arrived at Whispering Pines Campground 3 days ago, seeking solace in nature after a particularly grueling month at work. The campsite, with its view of the sprawling lake created by the massive hydroelectric dam, had seemed idyllic. Sure, there had been murmur among the other campers about recent heavy rains and rising water levels, but I had dismissed their concerns. The dam had stood for decades. Surely it could withstand a bit of extra water now. As I scrambled out of my tent into the pitch-black night, I realized how foolish that assumption had been. The sirens continued their relentless screech, and I could hear panicked shouts from nearby campsites. Fumbling for my flashlight, I swept its beam across the campground. The scene that greeted me sent a chill down my spine. People were running in every direction, some still in their pajamas, clutching whatever belongings they could carry. Children cried, dogs barked, and above it all those sirens wailed their dire warning. In the distance, I could see the dark silhouette of the dam, a wall of shadows against the night sky, and at its base a sight that turned my blood to ice, water churning and frothing, breaching the top of the structure in multiple places. The dam was failing. Reality hit me like a physical blow. We were in the flood zone. If that dam broke, we'd be swept away in minutes. I had to move now, adrenaline surging through my veins. I dove back into my tent, grabbing my backpack and shoving at anything I could reach: my phone, wallet, a bottle of water. There was no time for anything else. As I emerged, I nearly collided with my neighbor from the next campsite over, an elderly man named Frank I'd chatted with earlier in the week. We need to get to higher ground, he shouted over the din, his eyes wide with fear. There's a trail that leads up the hill behind the campground. It's our only chance. I nodded, falling into step beside him as we ran towards the tree line. All around us, chaos reigned. A woman stumbled past, dragging a screaming toddler. A group of teenagers huddled together, paralyzed with indecision. And through it all, that incessant siren wail punctuated now by a new, more terrifying sound, the deep, resonant groan of overstressed concrete. The trail Frank had mentioned was little more than a deer path barely visible in the weak beam of my flashlight. We stumbled upward, the uneven ground made treacherous by loose rocks and exposed roots behind us. I could hear others following, their ragged breathing and occasional cries of pain as they stumbled in the dark. We had climbed for perhaps 5 minutes when a sound like thunder split the air, even over the sirens and the panicked shouts. It was deafening. Frank and I froze, turning to look back down the hill. In the faint moonlight, I saw it, a massive section of the dam's central face on collapsing in on itself. Water exploded through the breach, a wall of fury and foam that seemed to devour everything in its path. The campground disappeared in seconds. Tents and RVs swept away like toys in a bathtub. Run! Frank's voice snapped me back to reality. Run, or we're dead. We scrambled upward with renewed desperation, clawing at the earth, pulling ourselves up by tree roots and low-hanging branches. The roar of the water grew louder with each passing second, drowning out even the sirens. Now I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet, the very hill we were climbing seeming to shudder in the face of nature's onslaught. Somewhere behind me, I heard a scream cut short. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every ounce of my being was focused on the path ahead, on the next handhold, the next step. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed in protest, but I pushed on. To stop was to die. I lost all sense of time as we climbed. It could have been minutes or hours. The world had narrowed to this, the feel of rough bark under my hands, the burn in my thighs as I pushed upward, the ever-present roar of the water behind us. Finally, mercifully, the ground began to level out. We had reached some kind of plateau high above where the campground had. Then I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my whole body shaking with exhaustion and residual terror. As my race heart began to slow, I became aware of others around me. A handful of people had made it this far, maybe 20 or 30 in total. Some were crying softly, others sat in stunned silence. Frank stood at the edge of the plateau, peering down into the darkness below. I crawled over to join him, dreading what I might see, but needing to know the sight that greeted me would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Where the campground had been was now a churning lake, debris-filled water stretching as far as the eye could see. In the dim pre-dawn light, trees stuck out of the flood at odd angles, and I could see the occasional glint of metal as the current tossed around the remains of RVs and cars of the dam itself. There was no sign. It had been entirely submerged by the very force it was meant to contain. As the sky lightened with the approaching dawn, the full scale of the disaster became clear. The valley bell below us had been transformed into a vast muddy lake. Here and there, rooftops poked above the water, farmhouses and barns that had stood for generations, now islands in a sea of destruction, and floating on the surface, a grim testament to the lives lost in the night. Shapes I tried not to look at too closely, but couldn't entirely ignore. We huddled on that hilltop for hours, watching as helicopters began to appear overhead, their spotlights sweeping across the transformed landscape. Eventually, rescue teams made their way to us, bringing food, water, and the promise of evacuation. As I was helped into a rescue basket to be winched up to a hovering chopper, I took one last look at the scene below. The dam, which had seemed so solid, so permanent just days ago, was gone. In its place was a reminder of nature's awesome, terrifying power, and of how quickly our lives can change, how fragile our sense of security really is. In the days and weeks that followed, I learned more about what had happened that night. The dam, weakened by years of neglect and stress beyond its limits by weeks of heavy rain, had finally given way. The resulting flood had claimed dozens of lives and caused billions in property damage. Investigations were launched, fingers were pointed, promises of never again were made. But for those of us who lived through it, who climbed the hill in the dark with death literally at our heels. No official report or government promise could erase the memory of that night. The sound of those sirens, the roar of the water, the desperate scramble for survival, these things became a part of us, a stark reminder of both the fragility and resilience of human life. Now, years later, I still wake sometimes in the night, heart racing, convinced I can hear the wail of flood sirens in the distance. In those moments, as I lie in the dark trying to slow my breathing, I think of Frank and the others who made it up that hill. I wonder if they too carry the weight of that night with them, if they, like me, see the world a little differently now, more aware of its dangers, yes, but also more appreciative of its beauty and the precious gift of each new day. And I think of those who didn't make it, whose names I read in newspaper articles and saw on memorial plaques. I think of the lives cut short, the futures erased in one terrible night. And I promise myself, as I do each time these memories surface, to live fully and deeply, to never take for granted the solid ground beneath my feet or the safety of a quiet night. Because if that night taught me anything, it's that everything can change in an instant. And when it does, all we can do is run, climb, and hope that when dawn breaks we're still standing. The acrid smell of burning rubber filled my nostrils as smoke billowed from under the hood of my car. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder of the desolate country road, my heart sinking as the engine sputtered its last. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and reds, but I couldn't appreciate the beauty. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell service and miles from the nearest town. I popped the hood, hoping against hope that it was something simple I could fix, but a steam hissed out, and I peered at the maze of pipes and wires. I knew I was out of my depth. I'm no mechanic, and even if I was, I had no tools. I slammed the hood shut in frustration, leaning against the car and surveying my surroundings. Fields stretched out on either side of the road, golden wheat swaying gently in the evening breeze. In the distance I could make out a farmhouse, a faint light glowing in one of its windows. It was my best shot at getting help. As I debated whether to start walking or wait for a passing car, I heard the rumble of an engine approaching. Relief washed over me as I turned to see an old pickup truck slowing down. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes rolled down his window. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice brawly but friendly. I nodded, grateful for the potential help. "Yeah, it just died on me." "I don't suppose you know anything about engines," he chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm afraid not, miss, but I can give you a ride into town if you'd like. There's a mechanic there who can probably help you out." I hesitated for a moment. Every instinct told me not to get into a car with a stranger, especially out here where no one would hear me scream. But as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, I realized I didn't have much choice. "That would be great, thank you," I said, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. He smiled, reaching over to open the passenger door. "Hop in, name's Earl, by the way, Sarah," I replied, climbing into the truck. The interior smelled of tobacco and pine air freshener, an odd but not unpleasant combination. Earl put the truck in gear, and we set off down the road. I kept my hand near the door handle, ready to jump out if necessary, but as we drove, Earl kept up a steady stream of friendly chatter that slowly put me at ease. He told me about his farm, about his grandkids who were coming to visit next week, about the time his own truck broke down miles from anywhere and he had to walk all night to get home. I found myself relaxing, even laughing at some of his corny jokes. But as we drove, I began to notice something odd. We'd been on the road for at least half an hour, and I hadn't seen any signs of a town. The fields had given way to dense forest, the road narrowing and becoming more winding. "Earl," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice, "are you sure this is the way to town?" He glanced at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the dashboard. Oh, don't you worry, we're taking a bit of a shortcut, it'll get us there quicker. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. I remembered all those true crime podcasts I'd listened to, all those stories of women who got into cars with seemingly friendly strangers and were never seen again. Actually, I said, my mouth dry, I think I'd prefer to go back to my car. I can wait there for a tow truck. Earl's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. Now, he said, his voice losing its friendly tone. Don't go getting all worked up. We're almost there. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I reached for the door handle, ready to jump out, even though we were moving at a dangerous speed. Just as my fingers closed around the handle, Earl slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt, and I was thrown forward, my seatbelt cutting into my chest. Before I could react, Earl had reached across me and locked the door. I'm sorry about this, he said, his voice oddly calm. But I can't let you leave, not yet. Panic overwhelmed me, helmed me. I clawed at the door, trying desperately to unlock it, but Earl grabbed my wrists, his grip like iron. Stop fighting, he growled. You'll only make it worse for yourself. I screamed, hoping against hope that someone would hear me. But we were miles from anywhere, surrounded by nothing but dark, silent forest. Earl started the truck again, driving deeper into the woods. I sat frozen in terror, my mind racing with all the horrible possibilities of what might happen to me after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. We pulled up to a small cabin. The headlights illuminated a decrepit porch, the wood rotting and the paint peeling. Earl got out, coming around to my side of the truck. He opened the door, grabbing my arm and pulling me out. I tried to resist, but he was much stronger than me. Please, I begged, tears streaming down my face. Please don't do this, just let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear. He ignored my pleas, dragging me towards the cabin. As we got closer, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Voices coming from inside. There was more than one person waiting for us. Earl pushed open the door, shoving me inside. I stumbled, falling to my knees on the dusty floor. As I looked up, my eyes widening in shock and confusion. I saw something I never expected. The cabin was filled with people, men, women, even a few children. They were huddled together, looking as terrified as I felt. And standing in the center of the room was a man I recognized instantly from news reports, the leader of a doomsday cult that had disappeared months ago. Welcome, the cult leader said, his voice soft but menacing. We've been waiting for you. Earl stepped forward, standing next to the cult leader. I brought another one just like you. As I looked around the room, my mind struggling to process what was happening. These people weren't Earl's accomplice, they were his victims, just like me. The cult leader began to speak, spouting nonsense about the end of the world and how we were the chosen ones who would survive. But I wasn't listening. My eyes were darting around the room, looking for any chance of escape. That's when I saw it, a small window near the back of the cabin. It was partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, but it looked big enough for a person to fit through. As the cult leader droned on, I slowly inched my way towards the window. The other captives watched me, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. I reached the window, my fingers fumbling with the latch. It was rusted shut, refusing to budge. I glanced back at the cult leader and Earl, but they were engrossed in their mad ramblings, paying no attention to me. With a surge of desperate strength, I managed to force the window open. The sound of creaking would fill the cabin, and everyone froze. Stop her, the cult leader yelled, but it was too late. I was already halfway out the window. I heard footsteps pounding behind me. As I tumbled out onto the ground, I scrambled to my feet, running blindly into the dark forest. Branches whipped at my face, and I tripped over unseen roots. But I didn't stop. I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit behind me, but I kept running. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but fear drove me onward. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours, but eventually the sounds of pursuit faded away, replaced by the normal nighttime noises of the forest. I slowed to a walk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had no idea where I was, or which direction would lead me back to civilization, but I knew I couldn't stop moving. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I heard a sound that made me want to cry with relief, the distant rumble of traffic. I followed the sound, eventually stumbling out onto a highway. A passing trucker saw me and stopped calling the police as I sat in the cab of his truck, waiting for help to arrive. The full weight of what had happened hit me. I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. In the days that followed, as I gave statements to the police and tried to process my trauma, I learned the full story. Earl had been recruiting for the cult for months, preying on stranded motorists. The police raided the cabin, freeing the other captives and arresting Earl and the cult leader. I was lucky to have escaped, but the experience left me changed. I became more cautious, more aware of the potential dangers lurking behind friendly faces. But it also showed me the strength I had inside me, a strength I never knew I possessed until I needed it most. Now, whenever I see someone stranded on the side of the road, I'm torn between the desire to help and the memory of that terrifying night. I usually end up calling the police or a tow truck for them, unable to drive by without doing something, but unwilling to put myself at risk again, because I learned the hard way that sometimes a helpful stranger can be the most dangerous person of all. The beam of my flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the cave walls. I tapped it against my palm, praying for it to steady, but the light only grew dimmer. In the oppressive darkness of the underground cavern, that fading light was our lifeline, and it was dying. Guys, I called out, my voice echoing off the damp stone walls. I think we have a problem. It was supposed to be a simple expedition. Sarah, Mike, and I had been planning this caving trip for months. We were experienced hikers, but this was our first time exploring a cave system this extensive. The thrill of adventure had overshadowed any concerns we might have had. Now, as the darkness pressed in around us, I was starting to realize how foolish we'd been. We had entered the cave system early that morning, armed with maps, ropes, and what we thought was plenty of supplies. The first few hours had been exhilarating. We marveled at the intricate rock formations, took photos of underground streams, and reveled in the sense of being the first people to see these hidden wonders, and who knows how long. But as we ventured deeper into the cave, things started to go wrong. First, we took a wrong turn, ending up in a section of the cave that didn't match our maps. We backtracked, but the twisting tunnels all started to look the same. Then Mike slipped on a wet rock, twisting his ankle. It wasn't serious, gone, but it slowed us down, and now our primary light source was failing. What do you mean a problem? Sarah's voice came from somewhere to my left. Tight with barely controlled panic, I swung my flickering beam in her direction, catching the reflection in her wide eyes. The flashlight's dying. I think the batteries are going. Mike limped over, his face pale in the dim light. That's impossible. We packed fresh batteries this morning. Well, apparently not fresh enough. I snapped, immediately regretting my harsh tone. This wasn't anyone's fault. We were all in this together. Sarah pulled out her phone, its screen illuminating her face with a ghostly glow. No signal, of course. But we can use the flashlight on here for a while. I nodded, grateful for her quick thinking. Good idea. Let's conserve it as much as we can, though we don't know how long we'll be down here. The reality of our situation was starting to sink in. We were lost in a maze of underground tunnels with limited light and no way to call for help. The cool, damp air that had felt refreshing hours ago now seemed to cling to my skin, chilling me to the bone. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We need a plan. We can't just wander around aimlessly. That'll only get us more lost. Mike nodded, wincing as he put weight on his injured ankle. We should try to retrace our steps, find our way back to the main tunnel. It was a good idea in theory, but as we started to move, it became clear how difficult It would be in practice. Every tunnel looked the same in the dim light of Sarah's phone. We turned down a path thinking it was familiar, only to end up in a dead end or a chamber we'd never seen before. Hours passed, though it was impossible to tell exactly how many. In the timeless dark of the cave, we rationed our food and water, knowing we might need to make it last. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the cave's ceiling. As we pushed on, the strain started to show. Mike's limp got worse, and Sarah's hands shook as she held the phone, its battery slowly but steadily draining. I felt a creeping claustrophobia, the weight of the earth above us seeming to press down harder with each passing minute. Then we heard it, a sound so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it, a low rumble, more felt than heard, reverberating through the rock around us. Did you guys feel that? I whispered, not sure why I was keeping my voice down. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. What was it? An earthquake? Before anyone could answer, the rumble came again, louder this time. Small pebbles skittered across the cave floor, and a fine dust rained down from above. We need to move, Mike said urgently. Now we stumbled forward, no longer caring about trying to find our way out. Our only goal now was to find somewhere that seemed stable, somewhere we might be safe. If the cave decided to come down around us, the rumbling continued, growing in intensity. Larger rocks began to fall, forcing us to dodge and weave as we ran. Sarah's phone flashlight bounced wildly, creating a strobe-like effect that made the whole scene feel like a nightmare. Just when I thought we couldn't go on any longer, we burst into a large chamber, the ceiling arched high above us, supported by massive columns of rock. It felt more stable than the narrow tunnels we'd been in, and without discussing it, we all headed for the center of the room. We huddled together as the cave shook around us. I could feel Sarah trembling beside me, heard Mike's ragged breathing. In that moment, faced with the very real possibility that we might die here, I felt a surge of affection for my friends. Whatever happened, at least we were together. The quake seemed to last an eternity, but it was probably only a few minutes. When it finally subsided, we were left in a thick, choking silence. Sarah's phone had gone dark, whether from damage or a drained battery. I couldn't tell. We were plunged into absolute darkness. I've heard people say they couldn't see their hand in front of their face, but I'd always thought it was an exaggeration. Now I understood. The darkness was complete, absolute. It pressed against my eyeballs, seeming to seep into my very being. Is everyone okay? I managed to croak out, my throat dry from the dust. I think so, Sarah replied, her voice small and scared. Mike grunted in affirmation, and I felt him shift beside me. We sat in silence for a long while, each lost in our own thoughts. The reality of our situation was impossible to ignore now. We were trapped, possibly buried alive, with no light and no way to call for help. Our chances of rescue, of survival, seemed vanishingly small, but giving up wasn't an option. We were still alive, still breathing. As long as that was true, we had to keep trying. Okay, I said, breaking the silence, we need to think. There has to be a way out of here. How? Sarah's voice cracked. We don't even know where here is anymore. No, but we know caves often have multiple entrances, Mike chimed in, and air has to be getting in from somewhere, or we'd have suffocated by now. He was right. I took a deep breath, trying to focus. All right, let's try to feel for any air currents. They might lead us to an opening. We spread out, crawling on our hands and knees, feeling our way across the rocky floor. It was slow, painstaking work. Every few minutes we'd call out to each other, using our voices to stay oriented in the pitch black. I don't know how long we searched. Time had lost all meaning in the darkness, but eventually I felt it, the faintest whisper of a breeze against my cheek. Guys, I called out, excitement making my voice shake. I think I found something. Sarah and Mike made their way over to me. Together we followed the weak air current, our hands running along the cave wall. The breeze grew stronger, and with it came a smell, fresh, green, alive. The outside world We quickened our pace, hope giving us renewed energy. The tunnel narrowed, forcing us to crawl on our stomachs at times, but we pushed on the promise of freedom driving us forward. And then suddenly it was a pinprick of light in the distance, so faint, I thought I was imagining it at first. But as we got closer, it grew brighter, sunlight filtering through a small opening in the rock. The hole was tiny, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was our way out. With desperate strength we clawed at the opening, widening it bit by bit. Rocks cut our hands, but we barely noticed the pain. Finally, the hole was big enough. One by one we squeezed through, emerging into the blinding sunlight of a late afternoon. We were on the side of the mountain, far from where we'd entered the cave system, but we were out, we were alive. As we lay on the grass, breathing in the fresh air and basking in the warmth of the sun, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for life, for friendship, for the simple joy of seeing light again. Our ordeal had lasted less than 2 days, but it had changed us forever. We gained a new respect for the power of nature and for our own resilience, but most importantly, we learned never to take the light for granted again. The first snowflake drifted lazily past the cabin window, a harbinger of the storm to come. I watched it disappear into the growing darkness, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. What had started as a peaceful family getaway was about to turn into something far more sinister. We arrived at the cabin 3 days ago. My wife, Lisa, our teenage kids, Jack and Emma, and myself. The forecast had mentioned a chance of snow, but nothing serious, just a light dusting to make our mountain retreat feel more picturesque. We stocked up on groceries, board games, and hot cocoa, ready for a week of family bonding and winter fun. The first 2 days had been idyllic. We went hiking, built snowmen, and spent evenings around the fireplace sharing stories and laughter. It felt like we were finally reconnecting after months of busy schedules and teenage mood swings pulling us apart. But as the third day dawned, things began to change. The sky grew heavy with clouds, and the wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the cabin. By mid-afternoon, the snow had started in earnest, fat flakes swirling down in a dizzying dance. At first, we were excited. More snow meant more winter wonderland to enjoy, but as the hours passed and the snowfall intensified, our excitement gave way to concern. Maybe we should think about heading back to town, Lisa suggested, peering out the window at the rapidly accumulating snow. I shook my head. The roads will be treacherous. By now we're safer staying put until it passes. Jack, ever the teenager, rolled his eyes. Relax, Mom, it's just a little snow. We've got plenty of food and the generator. If the power goes out, it'll be fun. If only I'd known then how wrong he was. The storm raged through the night, wind rattling the windows and snow piling up outside. When morning came, we awoke to a world transformed. The cabin was surrounded by a sea of white drifts piled high against the walls. The car was nothing more than a vague mound in the driveway. Holy crap, Emma whispered, her breath fogging the window as she stared out at the snowy expanse. I tried to keep my voice calm, not wanting to alarm the kids. Looks like we might be stuck here for a few days. Good thing we stocked up on supplies. Lisa shot me a worried look but nodded along. That's right, we'll just have a cozy few days inside until the plows can get through. But as the day wore on, it became clear that this was no ordinary snowstorm. The radio crackled with reports of record-breaking snowfall, closed roads, and overwhelmed emergency services. We were well and truly cut off. At first, we made the best of it. We played board games, read books, and took turns making meals in the small kitchen. But as hours turned into days, the strain began to show. The power flickered and died on. The second day of our confinement, the generator kicked in, but we had to ration its use to conserve fuel. The cabin grew cold, and we huddled together under blankets, our breath visible in the chilly air. Food became a concern. what had seemed like plenty for a week-long vacation suddenly looked woefully inadequate for an indefinite stay we started. Portioning out meals, trying to make our supplies last, but it wasn't just the physical discomforts that wore on us, the constant proximity, the lack of privacy, the uncertainty of when we'd be rescued, it all began to fray our nerves. Jack and Emma, once excited by the adventure of it all, grew sullen and irritable. They bickered constantly over everything, from who got the last cookie to whose turn it was to fetch more firewood. Lisa became quiet and withdrawn, spending hours staring out the window at the endless white landscape. I caught her crying silently in the bathroom one night, and when I tried to comfort her, she pushed me away. As for me, I felt the weight of responsibility crushing down. I was supposed to protect my family, to have all the answers, but as each day passed with no sign of rescue, I felt more and more helpless. It was on the 5th day that things really started to unravel. I woke early, the pale light of dawn barely penetrating the snow-covered windows. The cabin was silent, everyone else still asleep. I made my way to the kitchen, intent on taking stock of our remaining supplies. As I rummaged through the cupboards, a sound caught my attention, a faint scratching coming from the direction of the front door. My heart leapt. Could it be rescuers? I hurried to the door, fumbling with the latch, but when I pulled it open, I was met not with friendly faces, but with a wall of snow. The drift had piled so high it completely blocked the entrance. Cursing under my breath, I slammed the door shut. The noise must have woken the others, because I heard movement from the bedrooms. Dad, Jack's voice, still groggy with sleep. What's going on? I turned to see my son standing in the hallway, his hair tousled and eyes squinting against the dim light. Nothing, I lied, forcing a smile. Just checking the door. Go back to sleep. But Jack's eyes had already moved past me, focusing on something behind my back. His face pet. Dad, he said slowly. The cupboard. I turned, following his gaze. The cupboard door I'd left open in my haste to check the front door now revealed our dwindling food supply, or rather, what should have been our dwindling supply. The shelves were empty. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. We'd had at least a few days' worth of food left last night. Canned goods, dried pasta, cereal. It couldn't all just disappear. What the hell? I muttered, moving closer to inspect the bare shelves. By now Lisa and Emma had joined us, drawn by the commotion. Tom, Lisa's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. What's happening? I turned to face my family, their worried faces illuminated by the weak morning light. How could I tell them that our lifeline, our only means of survival in this frozen prison, had vanished overnight? Someone's been in here, I said finally, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. They've taken our food. The silence that followed was deafening. Then all at once, everyone started talking. What do you mean someone's been in here? Emma cried. That's impossible, Lisa said, shaking her head. We would have heard them. But it was Jack's reaction that chilled me to the bone. He didn't say a word, just stood there with a guilty look on his face. Jack, I said, my voice low, do you know something about this? He wouldn't meet my eyes. I might have taken a little extra last night. I was hungry, and a little extra. I exploded. Jack, everything is gone. The argument that followed was ugly. Accusations flew, voices raised. Lisa defended Jack. Emma sided with me. The unity we'd managed to maintain over the past few days shattered like thin ice. As the shouting reached a fever pitch, a new sound cut through the chaos, a low rumble growing louder. By the second, we all fell silent, exchanging fearful glances. Then the cabin shook, snow sliding off the roof with a muffled roar. For one terrifying moment, I thought the whole structure might collapse around us. When the rumbling stopped, we were left in a silence so complete it seemed to ring in my ears. Slowly, cautiously, we made our way to the windows. The world outside had changed once again. Where before there had been an unbroken expanse of white, now great cracks snaked across the snow's surface. In some places the ground had fallen away, entirely revealing yawning black chasms and avalanche. We'd been so focused on our own drama, we hadn't noticed the danger building right outside our door. As we stood there staring out at the transformed landscape, I felt a shift in the atmosphere of the cabin. The on and accusations of moments ago seemed petty in the face of this new threat. What do we do now? Emma whispered, her voice small and scared. I looked at my family, Lisa's pale face, Jack's guilty eyes, Emma's trembling lips. Despite everything, despite the fear and the hunger and the uncertainty, I felt a fierce surge of love for them. We stick together, I said firmly. We've made it this far, we'll find a way out. And as we huddled close, the wind howling outside and dangers lurking both within and without, I knew that our real test was just beginning. The storm had trapped us here, but it was our own actions that would determine whether we survived, not just physically, but as a family. The food was gone, the snow was unstable, and we were more alone than ever, but we had each other in that moment. I vowed to myself that it would be enough. It had to be. The beam of my headlamp cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow passage that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of long-forgotten secrets. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. This was it, the legendary lost copper mine, untouched for over a century. We had found it, but as I would soon discover, some things are lost for a reason. Are you sure about this, Alex? Sarah's voice echoed off the rocky walls, tinged with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I turned to face my fellow hiker, Sarah, Mike, and just their faces were pale in the harsh light of our headlamps, a combination of nerves and the fine layer of dust that seemed to coat everything down here. Come on, guys, I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. We've been planning this expedition for months. We can't turn back now. The truth was, I was just as nervous as they were. We were experienced hikers, sure, but amateur spelunkers at best. The old M shaft we discovered hidden behind a growth of dense vegetation wasn't on any of our maps. It was pure luck, or maybe fate, that we'd stumbled upon it. Mike stepped forward, always the voice of reason in our group. I don't know, Alex, this place looks pretty unstable. Maybe we should call it and let the professionals handle it. I shook my head. And let them take all the credit. No way. We found this place. We should be the ones to explore it. Jess, usually the most cautious of us all, surprised me by nodding in agreement. Alex is right. We might never get another chance like this. I say we go for it. Sarah still looked uncertain, but after a moment, she squared her shoulders and nodded. All right, but we stick together. Okay, no wandering off alone. With that decided, we began our descent into the earth. The tunnel sloped gently downward, its walls lined with old wooden support beams that creaked ominously. As we passed, our headlamps cast long dancing shadows that seemed to mock our intrusion into this long undisturbed place. As we ventured deeper, signs of the mine's former life began to appear. Rusty pickaxes and shovels littered the ground, and here and there we spotted the remains of old mining carts, their wheels frozen in place by decades of disuse. This is incredible, Jess whispered, her archaeologists taking in every detail. It's like stepping back in time. I had to agree. Despite the oppressive darkness and the constant nagging feeling that we shouldn't be here, I couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. We were the first people to see these sights in over 100 years. We had been walking for about an hour when we came to a fork in the tunnel. Both paths stretched into darkness, giving no clue as to where they might lead. Which way? Sarah asked, shining her light down on each passage in turn. I pulled out the old map we'd found in the town archives. It was faded and torn, barely legible in places, but it was the best guide we had. After studying it for a moment, I pointed to the left tunnel. This way. If I'm reading this correctly, it should lead us to the main excavation chamber. We continued on, the tunnel growing narrower and the air becoming thicker with dust. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from unseen crevices. Suddenly Mike stopped short, causing Jess to bump into him from behind. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all fell silent, straining our ears for a moment. I heard nothing but the pounding of my own heart. Then faintly, I caught it, a low rumbling sound, like distant thunder. "It's probably just the wind," I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. "Come on, we must be getting close." But as we pressed on, the rumbling grew louder. Small pebbles began to skitter across the ground, and a fine dust rained down from above. "Alex," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear, "I really think we should turn back." I was about to agree when suddenly the tunnel opened up into a vast chamber. Our headlamps couldn't reach the far wall or the ceiling, giving the impression that we were standing on the edge of an abyss. "This is it," I breathed. "The main chamber." As our eyes adjusted, we began to make out shapes in the darkness. Huge rusted machinery loomed like sleeping giants. Piles of rock and debris created an alien landscape, and there, glinting in the beam of my headlamp, was a vein of copper, or running through the rock face. We had found it, the mother lode that had eluded miners for decades. Our excitement was short-lived, however. The rumbling, which had faded to background noise, suddenly intensified. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble. "Earthquake!" Mike yelled. But I knew it was worse than that. The years of neglect, the weight of the earth above us, and our own intrusion had destabilized the already precarious mind. It was collapsing. "Run!" I shouted, already turning back towards the tunnel. We scrambled back the way we had come, the rumbling growing to a deafening roar. Rocks began to fall around us, small at first, then larger. I heard Jess cry out in pain as one struck her shoulder. But we couldn't stop. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember from our journey. And had we taken a wrong turn? The dust was so thick now that our headlamps were nearly useless, creating a disorienting strobe effect as we ran. A particularly violent tremor knocked us all off our feet. As I struggled to stand, I realized with horror that I could no longer see the others. "Sarah, Mike, Jess," I called out, my voice horror from the dust. "Over here." I heard Sarah's voice, faint and muffled. I moved towards the sound, my hand on the wall to keep my bearings. I found Sarah helping Jess to her feet. Jess's face was streaked with tears and dust, and she was cradling her arm. "Where's Mike?" I asked, dreading the answer. Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. We got separated when we fell." Another tremor shook the tunnel and more rocks fell. "We had to keep moving, Mike," I shouted one last time, straining to hear a response over the rumbling of the collapsing mine. "Nothing." With a heavy heart, I grabbed Sarah's hand. "We have to go now." We ran half blind through the crumbling tunnel. Every step could have been our last, every rumble potentially signaling a cave-in that would bury us alive. Just when I thought we couldn't go on any longer, I saw it, a faint glimmer of natural light ahead, the exit. With a final burst of energy, we sprinted towards it. Rocks were falling all around us, now the entire mine groaning as if in its death throes. We burst out of the tunnel and kept running, not stopping, until we were well clear of the mine entrance. As we turned to look back, we saw the entire hillside seem to shudder and then collapse in on itself, sending up a huge cloud of dust. We stood there gasping for air, covered in dust and blood from numerous small cuts. "Alive, but shell-shocked," Mike, Jess sobbed, clutching her injured arm. "He's still in there." The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. We had entered that mine force, strong, united in our excitement for adventure and discovery. Now we stood here, only three, broken and battered. As the dust began to settle, we heard a sound that made our hearts leap, coughing coming from the direction of the collapsed mine. In trance, we rushed over, hardly daring to hope, and there was Mike crawling out from under a fallen tree that had somehow shielded him from the worst of the collapse. He was covered in dust, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, but alive. We helped him to his feet, all of us too overwhelmed to speak. We had survived. but just barely the mine, with all its secrets and riches, was gone, buried under tons of rock and earth. As we made our way slowly back to civilization, I couldn't help but think about the miners who had come before us. How many of them had been lost to the mountain's hunger? How many had seen the glint of copper and pressed on despite the danger, only to have the earth swallow them whole? We had been lucky. We had escaped with our lives, if not unscathed, but the experience had changed us. We had gone looking for adventure and fortune, and instead found a stark reminder of nature's power and our own mortality. The lost copper mine would remain lost, its secrets buried deeper than ever, and we, the foolish explorers who had dared to disturb its slumber, would carry the weight of our experience for the rest of our lives. Some things we had learned are better left undiscovered. The antique clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its sound echoing through the empty rooms of the sprawling Victorian mansion. I jolted awake, my heart racing, unsure if the noise I'd heard was real or just another fragment of my increasingly vivid dreams. As I lay there in the darkness trying to calm my breathing, I heard it again, a soft thud coming from somewhere above me. I'd been house sitting for the Hendersons for 3 days now, and until this moment I'd managed to convince myself that the strange occurrences I'd been experiencing were just products of an overactive imagination. But now, alone in the dead of night, with that unmistakable sound coming from the supposedly empty upper floor, I couldn't deny it any longer. Something was very, very wrong in this house. The Hendersons were old family friends, and when they had asked me to watch their place while they went on a month-long European cruise, I jumped at the chance of beautiful historic home all to myself, with access to their pool and home theater. It seemed like the perfect summer gig, but from the moment I'd stepped through the front door, something had felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a general sense of unease, like I was being watched. I'd brush it off, tell myself I was just unused to being in such a big place alone. Then the little things started happening. I'd come back to rooms to find objects moved from where I'd left them. The TV would turn on by itself in the middle of the night. Once, I could have sworn I saw a shadow dart across the hallway out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. I tried to rationalize it all away. Old houses settle, causing things to shift. The TV probably had some kind of timer I didn't know about. The shadow was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew these explanations rang hollow now, as I lay frozen in bed listening to the unmistakable sound of footsteps overhead. All those rationalizations crumbled away. This was real, and I needed to face it. Slowly, I eased myself out of bed, wincing as the old floorboards creaked beneath my feet. I grabbed my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. As I searched for something, anything I could use as a weapon, my eyes fell on a heavy brass candlestick on the dresser. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Armed with my makeshift weapon and my phone, I crept out into the hallway. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if the very house was holding its breath in anticipation. I made my way to the stairs, each step feeling like an eternity, as I strained my ears for any further sounds from above. As I reached the second floor landing, I heard it again, a soft scraping noise, like furniture being moved, coming from the direction of the attic. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the candlestick. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to get out of the house and never look back, but curiosity, that fatal human flaw, propelled me forward. The attic door loomed before me, a dark maw ready to swallow me whole. I reached out my hand, trembling, and grasped the door knob. It was ice cold to the touch, sending a shiver down my spine. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The beam from my phone's flashlight swept across the attic, illuminating dusty old furniture draped in sheets, boxes piled high with forgotten memories, and cobweb-covered rafters. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But then my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the attic, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a rocking chair, and it was moving, creaking back and forth, as if someone had just vacated it, but there was no one there. I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The rocking slowed, then stopped altogether, leaving the attic in eerie silence. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then slowly, deliberately, it began to rock again. A whimper escaped my lips, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the stairs. In my haste to get away, I ran back to my room, slamming the door shut and wedging a chair under the doorknob for good measure. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the night huddled in bed, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. I needed answers. As soon as it was a reasonable hour, I called Mrs. Henderson. My voice must have betrayed my distress, because her cheerful greeting quickly turned to concern. "Sarah, what's wrong? Has something happened to the house?" I took a deep breath, trying to figure out how to explain without sounding crazy. "Mrs. Henderson, I think there might be something wrong with your house, something unexplainable." There was a long pause, was on the other end of the line. When Mrs. Henderson spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost resigned. "You've seen something, haven't you?" The question caught me off guard. "Yes, how did you know?" She sighed heavily. "Because we've seen things too. We didn't want to believe it. We thought if we ignored it, it would go away." My mind reeled. They had known all this time. What is it? What's happening in this house? "We don't know for sure," Mrs. Henderson said. "But the previous owners, they told us stories about the original family who built the house, about the tragedy that happened here." She went on to tell me a tale that chilled me to my core. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy industrialist for his wife and young daughter. But the family's happiness was short-lived. The daughter fell ill with a mysterious sickness, wasting away despite the best efforts of every doctor they could find. In his desperation to save his child, the father turned to darker methods. He began dabbling in the occult, performing rituals in the attic in a misguided attempt to cure his daughter. But instead of saving her, he opened a door to something that should have remained closed. The daughter died, and in his grief the father took his own life. The mother, driven mad by the loss and the things she had seen, spent the rest of her days in an asylum. The house stood empty for years, gaining a reputation as a place of ill fortune. "We didn't want to believe it," Mrs. Henderson finished. "We thought it was just local superstition. But then things started happening, little things at first." Then her voice trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. I understood now why they had been so eager to go on this trip, why they had jumped at the chance to be away from the house for an extended period. "What should I do?" I asked, my voice small and scared. "Leave," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Pack your things and go. We'll make arrangements for someone else to watch the house." "I'm so sorry we put you in this situation, Sarah. We should have warned you." I wanted to be angry at them for keeping this from me, for putting me in danger, but I could hear the genuine remorse in Mrs. Henderson's voice. They had been victims of this house too, in their own way. After hanging up, I wasted no time in packing my things. As I moved through the house gathering my belongings, I could feel eyes on me. The air seemed to thicken, as if the house knew I was trying to leave and was attempting to hold me back. Just as I was about to walk out the front door, I heard it again, that soft thud from upstairs. Against my better judgment, I turned to look up the stairs. There at the top I saw a figure, a small pale girl in an old-fashioned dress. Her eyes sad and pleading, she raised a hand as if reaching out to me, and then vanished. I ran until I reached my car, threw my bags in the back, and peeled out of the driveway. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent, and imposing its windows, like dark eyes watching me go. And there in the attic window, I could have sworn I saw the girl again, her small hand pressed against the glass. I never went back to that house. The Hendersons sold it soon after moving across the country to escape its influence. Sometimes late at night, I still dream of that attic, of the rocking chair moving on its own, of the sad-eyed girl reaching out to me, and I wonder not for the first time if leaving was really an escape, or if some small part of that house came with me, a shadow that will follow me for the rest of my days. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence. The usual chorus of bird song that had accompanied our mornings in the wilderness was conspicuously absent as I unzipped our tent and peered out into the misty dawn. An unsettling feeling crept over me. Something was different, something was wrong. We had been camping for 3 days now, myself, my best friend Jake, and his girlfriend Mia. It was supposed to be a week-long trip, a chance to disconnect from the world and enjoy nature. But as I surveyed our campsite, my blood ran cold. Carved into the trunk of every tree surrounding our clearing were strange symbols, intricate alien designs that seemed to glow faintly in the early morning light. They formed a perfect circle around our camp, an unbroken barrier that hadn't been there when we'd gone to sleep. "Jake," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jake, you need to see this." I heard rustling from inside the tent, followed by Jake's sleepy voice. "What's up, man? It's barely dawn. Just come out here, please." A few moments later, Jake emerged from the tent, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He froze when he saw the symbols, his face draining of color. "What the hell?" By now Mia had joined us, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Did you guys do this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I shook my head. "No way, these weren't here last night. Someone or something must have done this." While we were sleeping, we stood in stunned silence for a moment. The implications of what that meant sinking in. Someone had been in our camp mere feet from where we slept, carving these bizarre symbols into the trees. And we hadn't heard a thing. Jake was the first to snap out of it. "Okay, let's not panic. Maybe it's just some local kids playing a prank. We should pack up and head back to the trailhead." I nodded, grateful for his level-headedness. We quickly set about breaking camp, all of us casting nervous glances at the surrounding forest. The symbols seemed to watch us, their alien geometries making my head hurt if I looked at them for too long. It wasn't until we were nearly finished packing that we realized the true horror of our situation. Jake had gone to retrieve our bare bag, the sack containing our food that we'd hung high in a tree to keep it safe from wildlife. He came back empty-handed, his face ashen. "The rope's been cut," he said. "All our food is gone." Mia gasped. "But that's impossible. The noise would have woken us up." I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever or whatever had done this wasn't just playing a prank. They had deliberately cut off our food supply. "Maybe we missed a cache on the map," I suggested, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "There might be emergency supplies at one of the ranger stations." Jake nodded, pulling out our map. But as he unfolded it, his expression changed from hopeful to confused, then to outright fear. This isn't right." I looked over his shoulder and felt my stomach drop. The map was the same one we'd been using for the past 3 days, but now it was covered in the same strange symbols that surrounded our camp, the trail's landmarks. Everything had been obscured by the alien script. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath, "let's not freak out. We know the general direction of the trailhead. If we just head east, we're bound to hit a road eventually." We shouldered our packs and set off, trying to maintain a brave face. But as we walked, it quickly became apparent that something was very wrong. The forest looked different somehow. The trees seemed taller, more densely packed. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't, and more than once, I could have sworn I saw shapes darting just at the edge of my vision. Hours passed, and we should have reached the trailhead by now. but the forest showed no signs of thinning, no indication that we were nearing civilization. Our water was running low and hunger was beginning to gnaw at us. We need to stop and reassess, Jake said finally, his voice tight with stress. We found a small clearing and dropped our packs as Mia rationed out our remaining water. I climbed a tall tree hoping to get a better view of our surroundings. What I saw from the top made my heart sink. Forest stretched in every direction, unbroken by roads or clearings, and worse, I could see more of those symbols carved into trees in the distance, forming concentric circles around us. We weren't getting out, we were being herded deeper, and when I relayed this to Jake and Mia, the last vestiges of hope seemed to drain from their faces. What do they want from us? Mia asked, her voice small and frightened. Before anyone could answer, a twig snapped in the forest behind us. We whirled around, peering into the gathering darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, stood a figure. It was tall and possibly thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin seemed to shift and rippled like stat on an old TV, and carved into its flesh were the same symbols that surrounded us. We ran. Blind panic propelled us through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. I could hear something moving behind us, keeping pace, but never quite catching up. Night fell quickly, plunging the forest into an inky blackness that our flashlights could barely penetrate. We ran until our legs gave out, collapsing in a small hollow formed by the roots of a massive tree. As we lay there gasping for breath, reality began to set, and we were lost in a forest that defied logic, being hunted by something beyond our understanding. With no food and dwindling water, the gravity of our situation hit me like a physical blow. What do we do now? Mia whispered, clutching Jake's hand. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could I say? That we were going to be okay, that we'd find a way out. Any reassurance would have rung hollow in the face of our impossible situation. A sound cut through the night, a low melodic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. At once the air around us began to shimmer, and those damn symbols appeared again, floating in the air like holographic projections. Oh God, Jake breathed. They're coming. The humming grew louder, and with it came a pressure in my head, like something was trying to push its way into my mind. I saw Jake and Mia clutching their heads, their faces contorted in pain. Images began to flash before my eyes, vast impossible structures on alien worlds, creatures that defied description, moving through dimensions I couldn't comprehend, and through it all those symbols pulsing and shifting, trying to convey some meaning just beyond my grasp. I don't know how long we lay there, assaulted by visions of things no human was meant to see. It could have been minutes or hours, but eventually, mercifully, it stopped. When I opened my eyes, the forest was gone. We were lying on cold, smooth stone in a vast chamber that seemed to stretch into infinity. The walls, floor, and ceiling were covered in those now familiar symbols, glowing within an inner light. And we weren't alone. Surrounding us were the creatures, dozens of them, their bodies twisting and shifting in ways that hurt to look at. They made no move towards us, simply watched with eyes that weren't eyes. One of them stepped forward, its form solidifying into something almost but not quite human. When it spoke, the words appeared in my mind rather than being heard. You have been chosen, it said, to witness, to understand, to become. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but I was frozen in place, my body no longer under my control. Your world is but one of many, the creature continued. Your reality a thin veil easily pierced. We are the watchers, the keepers of gates, and you shall join us. As it spoke, I felt my body begin to change. My skin rippled and shifted, new appendages sprouting where none should be. I tried to scream, but my mouth was no longer a mouth. The last thing I saw before my vision changed forever was Jake and Mia undergoing the same horrific transformation. Then everything shifted, and I was seeing, feeling, experiencing reality in a way I could never have imagined. We had entered the forest. As humans, we would leave it as something else entirely. The Watchers had chosen us, and in doing so had erased our humanity forever. In the world we left behind, 3 more hikers would go missing, and those would search parties would find nothing but strange symbols carved into trees, and the forest would wait patient and hungry for its next victims, for we were the Watchers now. And the hunt would go on. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the torrent of rain as I squinted through the glass, searching for any sign of life along the deserted highway. That's when I saw her, a lone figure stumbling along the shoulder, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin. I slowed the car, my gut twisting with indecision. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but I couldn't bring myself to leave her out here in this storm. I pulled over, my hazard lights blinking weakly in the darkness. As I rolled down the window, she approached, her face hidden beneath a curtain of wet hair. "Are you okay?" I called out, having to raise my voice over the pounding rain. "Do you need a ride?" She looked up then, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Her eyes were wild, desperate, and there was a smear of something dark across her cheek that I prayed was just mud. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "please help me against my better judgment." I unlocked the door. She climbed in, bringing with her the smell of rain and something else, something metallic that made my nose wrinkle. "Thank you," she breathed, pushing her hair back from her face. In the dim light of the car's interior, I could see that she was young, probably in her early 20s, pretty despite being soaked to the bone and looking like she'd been through hell. "I didn't think anyone would stop. Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I pulled back onto the road. She hesitated just a beat too long. "The next town, Millbrook. Do you know it?" I nodded. It was about 30 m down the highway, a small, forable place I'd passed through 100 times on my sales routes. "I'm John," the first said, figuring I should at least introduce myself to the stranger I'd let into my car. "Alice," she replied, though something in her tone made me wonder if that was really her name. We drove in silence for a while, the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the drumming of rain on the roof the only sounds. I kept sneaking glances at Alice, trying to figure her out. Her clothes were expensive looking despite being soaked and muddy, and there was something about the way she held herself, tense and alert, that set me on edge. So I said, unable to bear the silence any longer, "What brings you out here on a night like this?" Alice flinched, as if my question had physically struck her. "I had car trouble," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Broke down a few miles back." It was a plausible enough story, but something about it rang false. I opened my mouth to ask another question, but she cut me off. "Look, I really appreciate the ride, but I'd rather not talk if that's okay. It's been a long night." I nodded, focusing back on the road, but my mind was racing. Who was this woman? What was she running from? Because it was clear now that she was running from something. We'd been driving for about 15 minutes when I saw them. Flashing lights in my rearview mirror, a police car coming up fast behind us. "Damn," I muttered, "looks like I might have been speeding." "Don't worry, I'll just explain the situation." But Alice wasn't listening. She had gone rigid in her seat, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the approaching police car. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no, please, you can't let them catch me." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about, Alice? What's going on?" She turned to me, then her eyes pleading. "I'll explain everything, I promise. But please, please don't stop. If they catch me, they'll kill me." I hesitated, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to stop, to let the police handle whatever this was, but something in Alice's eyes, the raw fear I saw there, made me do the unthinkable. I pressed down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, engine roaring, as we sped down the rain-slicked highway. The police siren wailed to life behind us, and I saw more flashing lights joining the pursuit. "Jesus Christ," I swore, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "What the hell have you gotten me into?" Alice was fumbling with something in her pocket. She pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle and thrust it at me. "Take it," she said urgently. "Hide it. They can't find this." I took the bundle without thinking, shoving it into my jacket pocket. "What is it, drugs?" She shook her head. "It's evidence, proof of what they've been doing, the corruption, the murders. It's all in there. My mind, real corruption, murders." What had I stumbled into the car fishtailed as we took a curve too fast, and I fought to keep control. The police were gaining on us, their sirens a constant nerve-shredding wail. "There's a turn-up up ahead," Alice said, leaning forward to peer through the rain-streaked windshield. "An old logging road. If we can make it, we might lose them." I saw it, a barely visible break in the trees. At the speed we were going, trying to make that turn would be suicide, but the alternative was to be caught by whoever was chasing us, and something told me that would be even worse. I made a split-second decision, wrenching the wheel to the right. The car skid, tires screaming in protest. For a hard-stopping moment, I thought we were going to flip, but then we were on the logging road, bouncing and jolting down the unpaved track. The dense forest closed in around us, branches scraping against the sides of the car. I killed the headlights, plunging us into near total darkness. It was madness to drive like this, but I could still hear the sirens behind us growing fainter, but not gone. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The old road twisted and turned, taking us deeper into the woods. Finally, when I could no longer hear any sign of pursuit, I brought the car to a stop in a small clearing. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the patter of rain on the roof. Then Alice turned to me, her face pale in the dim light. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant to drag anyone else into this." "Start talking," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Who are you really? And what the hell is going on?" She took a deep breath, seeming to gather herself. "My name isn't Alice, it's Detective Sarah Reeves. I've been working undercover for the past year investigating a ring of corrupt cops in Millbrook." The story she told me over the next half hour was like something out of a crime thriller. A small town police force running drugs, taking bribes, even committing murder to cover their tracks. Sarah had been sent in to gather evidence, but her cover had been blown earlier that night. "They came for me at my apartment," she said, her eyes haunted. "I barely got out alive. I managed to grab the evidence, but I lost my phone, my badge, everything when I saw you on the road. I thought you might be one of them." I sat back, trying to process it all. Part of me wanted to believe it was all an elaborate lie, that I hadn't just aided a fugitive and evaded the police. But the fear in Sarah's eyes, the conviction in her voice, it was too real to be fake. "So what now?" I asked, running a hand through my hair. "We can't stay out here forever." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "I have a contact in the state police. If we can get to him, show him the evidence, he can help us. But it's risky. They'll be watching the roads, and I don't know who else might be compromised." I thought about the bundle in my pocket, about the life I'd left behind when I decided to help this stranger. There was no going back now. I was in this for better or worse. "Okay," I said, starting the car again. "Let's do it." As we pulled out of the clearing, heading back towards the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had irrevocably changed. I'd set out on a routine sales trip and ended up in the middle of a conspiracy that went deeper than I could have imagined. But as I glanced at Sarah, her face set with determination, I knew I'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, whatever dangers we faced, we'd face them together. The night was far from over, and our story was just beginning. The first crack of thunder made us all jump, our nervous laughter barely masking the growing unease that had settled over our group. We'd been driving for hours looking for a motel when the storm hit with a vengeance. That's when we saw it, an old abandoned house looming out of the darkness, its windows dark and shuttered. Little did we know, seeking shelter there would be the worst decision of our lives. "Come on, guys," Mike said, his voice tinged with forced cheerfulness. "It's just for one night, better than sleeping in the car, right?" I wasn't so sure about that, but as another flash of lightning illuminated the torrential downpour outside, I knew we didn't have much choice. There were four of us: Micah's girlfriend Sarah, our friend Jake, and me. We'd been on a road trip heading to a music festival when our GPS led us astray down a series of increasingly remote back roads. We grabbed our bags and made a mad dash for the house, the rain soaking us in seconds. The front door was unlocked, swinging open with an ominous creak that sent a shiver down my spine. The interior of the house was musty and dark, years of neglect evident in the thick layer of dust coating every surface. Our flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper and furniture draped with yellowed sheets. This place is creepy as hell, Jake muttered, voicing what we were all thinking. Sarah, always the practical one, started pulling the sheets off the furniture. Let's just try to make it comfortable for the night. We'll leave first thing in the morning. We set about making a makeshift camp in what must have once been the living room. Mike got a fire going in the old fireplace, the warmth and light helping to dispel some of the house's oppressive atmosphere. As we huddled around the fire, drying our clothes and sharing the meager snacks we had left, I almost started to feel okay about our situation. That's when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car engine growing louder. As it approached the house, we all froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere on a night like this? Maybe it's the owner, Sarah whispered, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her doubt. The car came to a stop outside, its headlights casting long shadows through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. We heard car doors slam, then voices, men's voices, low and urgent. Mike quickly doused the fire, plunging us into darkness. We huddled together, hardly daring to breathe. As footsteps approached the front door, the door burst open and three men entered, their hulking silhouettes filling the doorway. They were carrying something large, duffel bags that clinked metallically as they moved. Coast is clear, one of them growled, leaving, get this stuff hidden and get out of here. They moved further into the house, apparently heading for the back rooms. As soon as they were out of sight, Mike grabbed my arm. We need to get out of here, he hissed now. But as we started to gather our things, we heard the men returning. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. We were trapped. The beam of a flashlight swept across the room, catching us in its glare. For a moment, everyone froze. What the hell? One of the men shouted. Who are you? Mike stepped forward, his hands raised placatingly. We're just travelers, got caught in the storm. We didn't mean to intrude. He was cut off by the sound of a gun being cocked. Shut up, the man snarled. You shouldn't be here. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could feel Sarah trembling beside me, hear Jake's ragged breathing. Look, Mike tried again, his voice admirably steady. We don't want any trouble. We'll leave right now and forget we ever saw you. The men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, the one who seemed to be in charge spoke. Can't let you do that, he said, his voice cold. And you've seen too much. It was at that moment that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the duffel bags had fallen open, spilling its contents onto the floor. Even in the dim light, I could see the glint of gold bars. We'd stumbled into the aftermath of a heist. What followed was a nightmare of fear and tension. The men who we came to know as Vince, Eddie, and Carl held us at gunpoint while they argued about what to do with us. It became clear that Vince, the leader, was in favor of permanent solutions, while Eddie seemed reluctant to add murder to their list of crimes. They tied us up and locked us in one of the back rooms, a musty old bedroom with a single rain-lashed window. As soon as the door closed behind them, we started working on our bonds. We need to get out of here, Sarah whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. They're going to kill us. We don't know that, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Maybe they'll just leave us here. Jake snorted. Yeah, right, you heard them. We're loose ends. I couldn't argue with that. The reality of our situation was starting to sink in, and panic clawed at my throat. We were miles from anywhere in the middle of a storm being held captive by armed robbers who were discussing whether or not to kill us. It was like something out of a bad movie, except this was terrifyingly real. Hours passed, marked only by the occasional rumble of thunder and the hushed voices of our captors filtering through the thin walls. We took turns working at our bonds, our wrists raw and bleeding from the effort. It was nearly dawn when I finally felt my ropes give way. Moving as quietly as I could, I untied the others. We were free, but we were far from safe. "What's the plan?" Jake whispered, rubbing his chafed wrists. I peered out the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a gray, misty morning. "We make a run for it," I said. "The car's still out front if we can reach it." I was cut off by the sound of approaching footsteps. We barely had time to resume our positions, pretending to still be tied up, before the door swung open. It was Eddie alone. He looked pale and nervous, his eyes darting around the room. "Listen," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I'm not like them. I never signed up for this. I'm going to help you get out of here." We exchanged skeptical glances. Could we trust him? Did we have a choice? Eddie quickly untied our fake bonds, explaining in hushed tones that Vince and Carl were asleep. We had a small window of opportunity to escape. We crept through the house, every creaking floor setting my nerves on edge. As we neared the front door, I started to believe we might actually make it. That's when everything went to hell. A floorboard groaned loudly under Jake's foot, and we heard a shout from upstairs. Gunshots rang out with splintering around us. As we ran for the door, we burst out of the house, sprinting for our car. I could hear Vince and Carl behind us, their curses mixing with the rapport of their guns. I dove into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. The others piled and screaming at me to go. The engine roared to life just as Vince and Carl emerged from the house, guns blazing. I forded gravel spraying as we fishtailed onto the road. Bullets pinged off the car, the back window exploding in a shower of glass. Sarah was screaming, Jake was yelling directions, and Mike was twisted in his seat watching for pursuit. We drove for what felt like hours, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving us shaky and silent. It wasn't until we reached the highway, merging with early morning traffic, that we finally started to believe we'd made it. We went straight to the police, of course, gave our statements, described the men and the house. They found the place, but it was empty. No gold, no robbers, not even Eddie. Sometimes late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of gunshots ringing in my ears. I see the glint of gold bars, feel the rough ropes on my wrists, hear Vince's cold voice discussing our fate. We went looking for shelter from a storm and found ourselves fighting for our lives. It's funny how quickly the world can turn upside down, how a wrong turn can lead you into a nightmare. I don't take road trips anymore, and I never ever seek shelter in abandoned houses. The wheel jerked violently in my hands as the car hit another deep rut, sending a spray of mud across the windshield. I cursed under my breath, squinting through the rain-streaked glass at the barely visible road ahead. This shortcut was turning out to be anything but and as the sky darkened with the approaching night, I was beginning to regret my decision to venture off the main highway. I'd been driving for hours trying to make it to my sister's wedding rehearsal dinner. The storm had slowed me down considerably, and in a moment of frustration, I'd followed my GPS's suggestion of a quicker route through the back roads. Now, as my car struggled through the muddy track that barely qualified as a road, I was painfully aware of how foolish that decision had been. The car lurched again, and this time I felt something give way underneath. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere as rain pounded relentlessly on the roof. No, I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine would but refuse to start. I slumped back in my seat, the reality of my situation sinking in. I was stuck on an unfamiliar road in the middle of a storm with no cell service. The rehearsal dinner was definitely out of the question now. I was contemplating my limited options when a flash of light caught my eye. Headlights approaching from behind. Relief washed over me. Maybe this good Samaritan could help me get back on the road, or at least to a place where I could call for a tow truck. The vehicle, an old pickup truck, pulled up beside me. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man in his 50s, his weather-beaten face creased with concern. Having some trouble there, he called out over the sound of the rain. I nodded, grateful for the potential help. Yeah, I think I hit something. The car just died on me. He peered past me at my car, then back at the road ahead. This stretch can be tricky. If you don't know it, tell you of why don't I give you a tow to my place? It's just up the road a bit. Got a phone you can use. And you can wait out this storm. Every stranger danger warning I'd ever heard flashed through my mind, but as another crack of thunder shook the sky, I realized I didn't have many options. I was already soaked from my brief attempt to check under the hood, and the thought of spending the night in my car was far from appealing. That would be great, thank you, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The man introduced himself as Earl as he helped me hook up my car to his truck. His manner was friendly, almost overly so, but I chalked it up to small-town hospitality. As we set off down the muddy road, Earl kept up a steady stream of chatter, asking about where I was from and where I was headed. A wedding, huh? He said. When I mentioned my sister, well, ain't that nice? Family's important, you know. Nothing more important than family. There was something in the way he said it that made me uneasy, but I brushed the feeling aside. We drove for what seemed like much longer than the just up the road. Earl had mentioned the rain had tapered off, but the sky was now pitch black, making it impossible to get my bearings. Finally, we turned onto a narrow driveway, coming to a stop in front of a large farmhouse. The paint was peeling, and the porch sagged, but warm light spilled from the windows, a beacon in the darkness. Home sweet home, Earl said, killing the engine. Let's get you inside, and dried off. As we approached the house, the front door swung open. A woman stood there, her thin frame silhouetted against the light. Something about her posture, the way she held herself, sent a chill down my spine. Martha, we've got a guest, Earl called out. Poor thing got stuck in the storm. Martha's eyes flicked from Earl to me, then back again. She nodded once, stepping aside to let us in. The interior of the house was cluttered but clean, with an odd mix of modern appliances and antique furniture. The walls were covered in old photographs, their subjects staring out with solemn expressions. You must be freezing, Martha said, her voice surprisingly soft. Why don't you go get changed? I've got some old clothes that might fit you. Before I could protest, she was ushering me up a narrow staircase. The upper floor was dark, lit only by a single bare bulb. At the end of the hallway, Martha pointed me towards a small bedroom, handing me a bundle of clothes before disappearing back downstairs. As I changed into the musty-smelling but dry clothes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room felt wrong somehow. The furniture was old-fashioned, almost like a museum display. And was it my imagination, or were those scratch marks on the inside of the door? I made my way back downstairs, my wet clothes bundled under my arm. Earl and Martha were in the kitchen, their heads close together, and whispered conversation. They fell silent as I entered, both turning to look at me with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Feel better? Earl asked, gesturing for me to sit at the kitchen table. Martha's just warming up some soup. You must be hungry after your ordeal. I wasn't actually. My stomach was in knots, every instinct screaming at me to get out of this house. But I smiled and thanked them, not wanting to seem ungrateful. So I said, trying to keep my voice steady, about that phone. Earl and Martha exchanged a look. Oh, wouldn't you know it, Earl said, shaking his head. The storm must have knocked out the lines. Happens all the time out here. My heart sank. No phone meant no way to call for help. I was completely at the mercy of these strangers. As Martha set a bowl of soup in front of me, I noticed her hands. They were covered in small scars, like she'd been repeatedly scratched by something or someone. You've got a lovely home, I said, desperate to fill the uncomfortable silence. Have you lived here long? Oh, ages, Earl replied, his eyes taking on a faraway look. This house has been in the family for generations. Lots of history here, lots of secrets too. Martha added, her voice barely above a whisper. I nearly choked on my soup. What do you mean? Earl laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh, every old house has its secrets, isn't that right, Martha? Martha nodded, that same eerie smile playing on her lips. Indeed, and sometimes those secrets have a way of resurfacing. The conversation that followed was one of them. Most unsettling of my life. Earl and Martha spoke of the house's history, of family members long dead, in a way that made it sound as if they were still present. They referred to events from the distant past as if they had happened yesterday. As the night wore on, my unease grew. I made excuses about being tired, hoping they would show me to a guest room, but Earl insisted I stay up, regaling me with more stories about the house and its inhabitants. It was well past midnight when I heard a thump from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I froze, my eyes darting to Earl and Martha. They showed no reaction, continuing their conversation as if nothing had happened. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking. Earl cocked his head, feigning confusion. Hear what? That noise from upstairs? It sounded like, oh, that's just the house settling. Martha interrupted, her tone dismissive. These old places make all sorts of noises. But I knew what I'd heard, and as the night progressed, the noises continued: creaks, thumps, and once what sounded horribly like a muffled scream. By the time Earl finally showed me to a guest room, I was a nervous wreck. The room was small and stuffy, with a narrow bed pushed up against the wall. As Earl bid me good night, I noticed him locking the door. From the outside, sleep was impossible. I lay in the dark, every creak of the house setting my nerves on edge. The photographs on the wall seemed to watch me, their eyes following my every move. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I had to get out of this house, car or no car. I quietly gathered my things and tried the door. To my surprise, it was unlocked. The house was silent. As I crept downstairs, I had just reached the front door when a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, find Earl standing there, a sad smile on his face. Leaving so soon? He asked. But you haven't met the rest of the family yet. As if on cue, figures began to emerge from the shadows, men and women in outdated clothes, their faces pale and gaunt with a jolt of horror. I recognized them from the photographs. I ran out the door, down the driveway. Not daring to look back, I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. When I finally stopped, the house was nowhere in sight. It took hours of walking before I reached a main road where a kindly truck driver gave me a ride to the nearest town. I reported my experience to the local police, but they just shook their heads. There was no record of an Earl or Martha living in the area, and no farmhouse matching my description. Sometimes late at night, I still hear those footsteps, still see those ghostly figures emerging from the shadows, and I wonder about that house standing alone in the darkness, waiting for its next unsuspecting guest. The first drop of blood on the forest floor stopped us dead in our tracks. It was vivid against the dark earth, a stark reminder that we were no longer alone in these woods. What had started as a leisurely hike had suddenly turned into something far more sinister, and the weight of our discovery hung heavy in the air between us. I'd known Jake and Sarah since college, and we'd made it a tradition to go on an annual camping trip together. This year, we'd chosen a remote trail in the Adara, eager to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. The first 2 days had been idyllic: crisp mountain air, stunning vistas, and the kind of easy camaraderie that comes from years of friendship. But on the third day, everything changed. We'd veered off the main trail following a barely visible path that promised a shortcut to a secluded waterfall. That's when Sarah spotted it, a single perfectly round drop of blood on a fallen leaf. Guys, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, look at this, Jake. And I crowded around peering at the leaf. It's probably just from an animal, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Maybe a deer that got scratched by a branch. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The blood was fresh, still glistening in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy above. Jake knelt down, examining the ground around the leaf. There's more, he said, pointing to a faint trail of droplets leading deeper into the forest. It looked like whatever it is, it's heading that way. We exchanged uncomfortable glances. The smart thing to do would be to turn around, pretend we hadn't seen anything, and continue on our planned route. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw, got the better of us. We should check it out, Sarah said, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and excitement. What if someone's hurt and needs help? I wanted to argue, to point out all the reasons why following a mysterious blood trail in the middle of nowhere was a terrible idea. But I could see the determination in Sarah's face, and then I knew Jake would side with her. So against my better judgment, I nodded, and we followed the blood trail as quietly as we could through the underbrush. The drops became more frequent, larger, forming a clear path through the forest. The air felt thicker, somehow charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After about 10 minutes of walking, we came to a small clearing. What we saw there made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing was a deer carcass, freshly killed and partially butchered. But this was no ordinary hunter's kill. The animal had been arranged in a deliberate pattern, its limbs sped out in unnatural angles around it, drawn in what could only be the deer's blood. Were strange symbols I didn't recognize. What the hell? Jake breathed, his face pale. Sarah had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. We need to go, she whispered now. But before we could move, a twig snapped somewhere behind us. We whirled around, hearts pounding, to see a figure step out from behind a tree. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with wild eyes and matted hair. He was dressed in tattered clothes that might once have been hunting gear, and in his hand he held a wicked-looking knife, its blade dark with blood. Well, he said, his voice a raspy growl. Looks like we've got some uninvited guests. I felt Sarah grip my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. Jake had shifted into a defensive stance, placing himself between us and the stranger. We're sorry, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We didn't mean to intrude. We'll just be on our way. The man's face split into a grin, revealing yellow teeth. Oh, I don't think so. You've seen too much now. Can't have you running off and telling tales, can we? As he spoke, more figures emerged from the trees around us, 3, 4, 5 of them, all with the same wild look, all armed. We were surrounded. What followed was a nightmare of fear and desperation. We ran crashing through the underbrush with no regard for STE or direction. All that mattered was getting away from those men and their mad rituals. I could hear them behind us, their shouts and the crashing of their pursuit spurring us on. My lungs burned and branches whipped at my face, but I didn't dare slow down. We burst out of the tree line onto a rocky outcropping overlooking a steep ravine. The drop was easily 100 feet with a rushing river at the bottom. We skid to a halt at the edge, trapped between the cliff and our pursuers. What do we do? Sarah gasped, her eyes wild with panic. Jake was looking frantically around, searching for an escape route. We can't go back, he said. They'll catch us for sure. I peered over the edge of the cliff, my stomach lurching at the dizzying drop. We can't jump either. It's too far. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. We had seconds at most before they would be upon us. That's when I spotted it, a narrow ledge running along the cliff face, just wide enough for a person to edge along. It disappeared around a bend in the rock, potentially leading to a way down there. I said, pointing. It's our only chance. Sarah looked at the ledge, then back at the forest, where we could now see movement among the trees. Are you insane? We'll fall. We don't have a choice, Jake said grimly. It's that or face those maniacs. With no time left to argue, we began to edge our way along the ledge. The rock was slick with spray from the river below, making each step treacherous. I went first, then Sarah, with Jake bringing up the rear. We had made it about halfway around the bend when our pursuers burst out of the forest. Their shouts of anger turned to howls of frustration when they saw us on the ledge. Keep going, I called back to the others. Don't stop, don't look down. But even as I said it, I heard a scream. Sarah had slipped, her foot skidding on the wet rock. She teetered on the edge for a heart-stopping moment before Jake grabbed her, hauling her back against the cliff face. The men on the cliff top were getting bolder. One of them had produced a rifle and was taking aim. The crack of gunfire echoed off the rocks, and chips of stone exploded inches from my head. Move, Jake yelled, pushing Sarah ahead of him. Go, go, go. We scrambled along the ledge, bullets pinging off the rock around us. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, the ledge widened, revealing a narrow path leading down the cliff face. We half ran, half slid down the path, loose rocks skittering away under our feet. The shouts from above grew fainter as we descended, until finally, mercifully, we reached the bottom of the ravine without pausing to catch our breath. We plunged into the icy river. The current was strong, threatening to sweep us away, but we fought against it, struggling towards the far bank. By the time we dragged ourselves out of the water on the other side, there was no sign of our pursuers. We collapsed on the rocky shore, gasping for air, our bodies shaking with cold and adrenaline. Do you think we lost them? Sarah asked between chattering teeth. Jake nodded, scanning the clifftop. I think so. No way they could follow us down here. As the immediate danger passed, the reality of our situation began to sink in. We were miles from our campsite, soaking wet, with no supplies and no idea where we were. And somewhere out there, a group of murderous cultists was probably still looking for us. We need to find help, I said, struggling to my feet. A ranger station, a town, anything. We set off along the riverbank, exhausted but driven by the need to put as much distance between us and that clearing as possible. It was nearly dark by the time we stumbled upon a road, and another hour before a passing truck stopped to help us. The local police were skeptical of our story, but a search of the area where we'd been camping turned up evidence that corroborated our account. They found the remains of several animals arranged in ritualistic patterns, along with signs of a long-term camp hidden deep in the woods, but of the men who had chased us there was no sign. They had vanished back into the forest, leaving behind only the chilling memory of their mad eyes and bloody knives. We never went camping again after that. The experience left us changed, more aware of the darkness that can lurk in the wilderness and in the hearts of men. Sometimes late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of those inhuman howls ringing in my ears, and I wonder about those men, about what drove them to such madness, and whether they're still out there waiting for their next unsuspecting victims to stumble upon their unholy rituals. The forest holds many secrets, some beautiful, some terrifying. We were lucky to escape with our lives, but the scars of that day will stay with us forever. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the wilderness walk on two legs. The first thing I noticed about him was the blood. It was caked under his fingernails, smeared across his torn shirt, and matted in his wild, unkempt hair. He stumbled into our campsite just as the sun was setting his eyes wide and unfocused, incoherently, about being lost in that moment. As my family froze in shock and fear, I had no idea that this stranger's arrival would turn our peaceful camping trip into a night of terror and survival. We had been looking forward to this trip for months. My wife, Lisa, our two kids, Tommy 12 and Sarah 9, and I had planned a week-long adventure in the Cascade Mountains. It was our chance to disconnect from the world, bond as a family, and enjoy the great doors. The first 3 days had been idyllic, hiking, fishing, and sitting around the campfire telling stories and roasting marshmallows. But on that 4th evening, everything changed. I was tending the fire while Lisa prepared dinner. Tommy and Sarah were playing a card game nearby when we heard the rustling in the underbrush. At first, I thought it might be a deer or maybe even a bear, and I reached for the bear spray we kept handy. But then he appeared, this stranger who looked like he'd been through hell. Help, he coaxed, stumbling towards us. Please, I'm lost, Lisa gasped. Pulling the kids close to her, I stood up slowly, my hand still on the bear spray. Sir, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Are you all right? Are you hurt? He shook his head frantically, his matted hair whipping around his face. Lost for days, can't find my way back. As he got closer, I could see that what I had initially thought was dirt on his clothes was actually dried blood. My heart raced, but I tried to maintain a calm exterior for my family's sake. Okay, just take it easy, I said, holding up my hands in what I hoped was a reassuring gesture. We can help you. Why don't you sit down by the fire, and we'll get you some water. He nodded gratefully and collapsed onto one of our camp chairs. Lisa, her face pale with worry, handed me a bottle of water, which I passed to the stranger. He gulped it down greedily, water and saliva dribbling down his chin. What's your name? I asked. Once he had finished drinking, John, he rasped. John Carlisle. All right, John, can you tell us what happened? How did you get lost? John's eyes darted around nervously, never quite focusing on any of us. Hiking with friends, got separated, been wandering for days. Something about his story didn't quite add up. If he'd been lost for days, why hadn't we heard any search helicopters or seen any rescue teams? And the blood, where had it come from? If he wasn't injured, I glanced at Lisa, and I could see the same doubts reflected in her eyes. She nodded slightly, understanding my unspoken message to keep the kids close. John the First said carefully, we have a satellite phone. We can call for help, get a rescue team out here. At the mention of calling for help, John's demeanor changed instantly. His eyes, previously unfocused, suddenly sharpened with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. No, he shouted, leaping to his feet with surprising agility. No calls, they'll find me. Tommy and Sarah whimpered, pressing closer to Lisa. I stepped between them and John, my hand tightening on the bear spray. We'll find you, Jan, I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. Who are you running from? John's eyes darted around wildly, as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows at any moment. The others, he whispered, the ones who changed, they're hunting me. A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. This man wasn't just lost, he was delusional, possibly dangerous. We were miles from the nearest town, with no way to call for help without agitating him further. Okay, John the First said soothingly, no calls. Why don't you just sit back down, and we'll figure this out for a moment. He seemed to calm down, sinking back into the chair. But then Sarah, in a small and frightened voice, come, ask Daddy. Why does the man have blood on him? John's head snapped towards her, his eyes wild. Blood? He muttered. Yes, blood. Had to defend myself. They tried to take me, but I fought back. I won. He stood up again, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I could see Lisa from the corner of my eye, slowly edging the kids towards the tent. John the First said, trying to draw his attention back to me, why don't you tell me more about these others? Who are they? But John wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on Sarah, a strange, hungry look on his face. So young, he murmured, so pure. They haven't gotten to her yet. That was all I needed to hear. In one fluid motion, I raised the bear spray and unleashed a cloud of burning mist directly into John's face. He screamed, a sound more animal than human, clawing at his eyes. I turned to my family, shouting, run, get to the car. Lisa didn't hesitate. She scooped up Sarah and grabbed Tommy's hand, sprinting towards our SUV parked a short distance away. I stayed behind, keeping myself between them and the howling, crashing John. But even blinded and in pain, John was unnaturally strong. He lunged forward, catching me off guard and tackling me to the ground. We grappled in the dirt, his hands clawing at my face, trying to gouge my eyes. I could smell his rancid breath, see the madness in his bloodshot eyes. You can't stop it, he screamed. The change is coming for all of us. With a surge of desperate strength, I managed to knee him in the stomach and push him off. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I reached the car just as Lisa was starting the engine. I dove into the passenger seat, yelling, "Go, go, go!" Lisa floored the SUV, fishtailing on the uneven forest road in the rearview mirror.